Hi, can you see people coming onto the webinar now? And should I wait a minute or should I get going?
I would wait a minute because we're seeing people come on.
Great.
Yeah, people are coming on.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. We are just seeing people still entering the web meeting. So we're going to wait just one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining today. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Executive Director here at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to the conference, Reimagining Clinical Trials, Learnings from COVID-19. Next slide, please. The MRCT Center is a research and policy center focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment of global clinical trials. Next slide. Our vision is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials, and we do our work by engaging and convening a multi-stakeholder group, including industry, academia, government, nonprofit, patient and patient advocates, to come together to define emerging issues and create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. And over the past decade, the MRCT Center's efforts have resulted in the implementation of best practices, greater transparency, and improved safety for participants. Next slide. We have seen a lot of innovation, resilience, and hard work over the last 16 months related to running clinical trials. The COVID pandemic has opened our eyes to what could and should be possible for clinical trials. And in early 2021, the MRCT Center's Executive and Steering Committee challenged us to think long-term about the changes that should and could be made to sustain clinical trials in the future. And this conference is the result of that. There have been a number of conferences on lessons learned, but what we're interested in doing here is to really think about a long-term vision. How are we preparing for clinical trials of the future? What are the possibilities, the flexibilities, the complexities, and the barriers? We have two meetings as part of this conference. Today, we're going to talk about permissible flexibilities to study conduct and coordination. And then we're also going to think about the implications of the clinical trial workforce. Next Thursday, June 24th, we'll focus on the regulatory flexibilities and international cooperativity and governance. Next slide. Our goal in these meetings is to really look into the future. Our speakers and panelists are going to discuss what is the vision for how multi-site, multinational clinical trials are going to be conducted, what worked, but also what didn't work, and what we still need more information and analysis on. And we'll also think beyond cataloging and think about the how. How do we build the experience of clinical trials during COVID that we've learned about during the COVID-19 pandemic and be prepared for the future. Next slide, please. Here is our agenda for today's meeting. After today's keynote, you'll hear from a diverse set of panelists, and our moderators today have been asked to really facilitate and push the conversation towards that long-term vision of the future of clinical trials. Next slide. We do have closed captioning available, and you can view it by changing your settings. And the chat and the Q&A function are open, and we'll be monitoring them on our end. Next slide. Before I turn it over to Barbara to introduce today's keynote speaker, on behalf of the MRCT Center, I'd like to say a very big thank you to the planning committee for this conference, who have been tremendous in the design and the development of the panels that you're going to hear both today and next Thursday, and their names are listed on this slide. So now I'd like to introduce Barbara Beer, Faculty Director of the MRCT Center. Over to you, Barbara.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone who's joining. And let me add my welcome to everyone and my thanks to the planning committee. I have to say I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Esther Krova, who is the Executive Director of Faster Cures, which is a center of the Milken Institute, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. Faster Cures is a really dedicated to accelerating patient-centered and treatments as rapidly as possible, decreasing barriers, etc. And Esther has been incredibly involved of late in developing an action plan for the US government in terms of thinking about what we need to push forward. Esther was previously the Director of Public Policy, leading Glaxo's previously who is Director of HR, had also worked at program at the national governors. I think it's really an honor and pleasure to introduce Esther. I think we first met when she was about a week old at Faster Cures, when in-person meetings were still possible, and we were down in Washington, D.C. But since then, we've become really wonderful colleagues, and I can't say enough about what a pleasure it is to hear from her today. She will present a lot of the work that she's been doing and leading over the last many months to position us for the future. And I thought it was important to ground some of these considerations for the conference today in a more US vision, with the eye towards how to extend this to multinational and multi-site, multi-regional trials. So with that, Esther, we look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Barbara. What a warm welcome. I do recall when you and I met in person in our Washington, D.C. office, and we were already fast friends, partly because I had two of my kids at Brigham and Women, but we've also become great colleagues and collaborators over the last several months in particular. So I'm delighted to be with all of you today. What an incredibly exciting topic. Very, very relevant for where we are as a country, as we are in these waning days, hopefully, fingers crossed, from the pandemic. But we certainly recognize the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost due to this pandemic. And it's absolutely appropriate that we should talk about lessons learned. And we will have a lot of lessons learned across the entire public health response to COVID-19. But very importantly, this conversation that we're having today about the future of clinical trials is extremely relevant, as well as the role of our clinical trial infrastructure and our clinical trial enterprise really came to the forefront. So why don't we go ahead and turn to the slide deck presentation. So what I'm going to share with you today is really informed, as Barbara mentioned, by our efforts at Faster Cures to document the lessons learned coming out of COVID-19 and accelerating biomedical research. In fact, our white paper on this topic was released earlier this year. And if you can believe it or not, we were documenting lessons learned at the height of the pandemic. About this time last year, we were having a series of interviews with key leaders, from Dr. Francis Collins to Dr. Tony Fauci, to leaders within FDA industry, patient-led disease organizations, and many other stakeholders as well that informed that effort. The reason why we wanted to capture things in real time, because we recognized how easy it is to forget things when you move away from the acute pain points that you're experiencing. This talk is also informed by my efforts with the National Academies. I've been co-chairing an effort with Stephen Galson at Amgen on a 4-part workshop series around transforming the clinical trial enterprise 2030, and also for my involvement in a recent US government-led effort to understand lessons learned from COVID-19 therapeutic trials, and also engaging with multiple stakeholders, including master protocols leading COVID-19 treatment trials. So a lot of conversations have really boiled into some takeaways that we can glean from this, but also look forward to the rest of the discussions today. If we go to the next slide, I thought I would actually begin by taking a giant step back. When we think about our clinical trial infrastructure in this country, I think it's important for us to understand how it is situated within our healthcare ecosystem. That in fact, our healthcare ecosystem, when you think about this in the context of comparisons with our peers, with other high-income countries, OECD countries, the US spends nearly twice as much as the average OECD country on healthcare as a share of its economy, largely driven by medical technologies and higher prices. If you go to the next slide, we also, despite unfortunately that level of investment, have the lowest ranking in terms of healthcare outcomes. When we look at life expectancy in the US, again, compared to our peers, our life expectancy at birth is 2 years lower than OECD average. If you go on to the next slide, this of course does not improve when we start to talk about chronic disease burden. We also have the highest chronic disease burden and obesity among our peers. According to the CDC, 6 in 10 adults have chronic disease, 1 chronic disease, 4 in 10 adults have 2 or more. This includes heart disease, chronic lung disease, diabetes, and the list goes on. If you go on to the next slide, we also spend the most of our peers in investment in biomedical R&D, both public and private sector spending. And we should be commended in terms of our leadership and investment in R&D. However, as we'll talk about today, despite this level of investment, as you can see with all the multiple levels of sponsors of investment in R&D, our ecosystem is inefficient and is siloed, and you can say it is also fragmented. If you go on to the next slide, this siloed nature and the fragmentation of our clinical trial ecosystem and R&D ecosystem was very much revealed during COVID-19. Hundreds of investigators launched preclinical or clinical trials investigating antivirals, antibodies, mRNA, repurposed drugs from other conditions, numerous other compounds, technologies, and devices that could be of potential use in mitigating the disease. I, in fact, had many phone calls at the beginning of the pandemic when we launched our COVID-19 treatment and vaccine tracker with many different companies and or investigators wanting to make sure their studies were documented there. Academic research institutions, of course, also launched their own efforts, as did industry, all for a good cause, right? We were trying to be as responsive as possible with regard to COVID-19. The challenge, however, is that we had very little alignment in terms of research priority across all of those types of research investigators. Where should we have the appropriate level of investments and resources to answer the most urgent questions? Which of treatments were most effective for hospitalized patients versus those for mild or moderate disease? And in some cases, we also experienced competition for patients enrolling into trials, despite thousands of patients all over the country infected with COVID-19. As you can see from this data, and Dr. Janet Woodcock at FDA has referenced this many times based on their analysis, that only 5% of COVID-19 clinical trial arms will yield generalizable information on safety and efficacy, either given small enrollment or poor design in the vast majority of those trials. So while we should be commended in terms of the medical research response from COVID-19 on the therapeutic side, we really did suffer from that fragmentation and lack of alignment. If you go on to the next slide, this is one of the reasons why I took this map from clinicaltrials.gov. It does a nice job of showing us where study arms are located around the country geographically. The red states are where we see the most number of studies. Unsurprisingly, we see very significant hubs in the New England, Northeast region, and then of course on the West Coast, and then some scattering around the country. However, very few networks exist in community-based setting. The vast majority of where our clinical trial networks are situated are in academic research institutions. And even for those community-based settings that are involved in clinical trials, the barriers to entry are quite high. Barriers given data systems that need to be upgraded or developed anew, workforce challenges, adequate training, reimbursement, and the appropriate expertise to conduct those trials. If you go on to the next slide, another learning coming out of COVID, of course, has been our lack of representation and health equity issues writ large across our healthcare system, it is also very much notable around clinical trials. When we look at representation in clinical trials, we don't necessarily see consistently that trials reflect the burden of disease. When we look at cardiovascular drugs, for example, approved by the FDA between 2006 and 2020, 2.9% were Black participants. We see the same delta, if you will, with other disease conditions, diabetes and various cancers. When we look at multiple myeloma as an example, 20% of patients are Black, however, only 4.5% of multiple myeloma patients participate in clinical trials with data starting in 2003. The bright spot out of this data, however, are the COVID-19 vaccine trials, particularly Moderna and Pfizer and the others, who made a concerted effort to enroll populations that were disproportionately affected by the disease. And a lot of that came because of the challenges and the foresight to think about levels of vaccine acceptance if those populations were not included in the clinical trials. And in many cases, those trials slowed down to ensure enrollment met populations that were reflective of those groups, generally speaking. So we did pause and we did do a nice job there. And I think we have a lot of learnings to take away from that. So if we go on to the next slide, all of this has culminated into really a re-emerged focus around designing a better clinical trial system, that we should not let COVID-19 go to the wayside and not use it as a catalyst opportunity for us to think about the system anew. Emerging from the National Academy's workshop series, there are a few key themes that came out of the breakout discussions, a number of the speakers that we had. As part of that, I'll just touch on these three themes around a new system that is focused on efficiency, engagement, and coordination. If we first turn to efficiency on the next slide, we all know that clinical trials are becoming increasingly complex. Studies are looking for narrower patient populations, stringent inclusion and exclusion criteria. However, we did see that it is possible for us to have significant enrollment in pragmatic trials. For example, a bright spot is the UK recovery trial. They demonstrated that you can have a simple protocol embedded within a clinical research network as part of the National Health Service there in the UK. When I looked at the data just recently, they've had over 40,000 patients enrolled in those trials, in that trial in 181 active sites that include community-based sites. They were able to generate fast answers on therapies such as dexamethasone, negative answers on hydroxychloroquine, very helpful information for clinical implications for patients suffering from COVID-19. The National Institutes of Health active trial, which also leverages a master protocol, has also been quite helpful in establishing multiple different studies to look at therapeutics as well. We have great other examples from REMAP-CAP as well as I-SPY COVID. REMAP-CAP previously was established for community-based or community-acquired pneumonia, and they pivoted toward COVID. So when we look at the right-hand side, what are some themes and approaches that are emerging around efficiency that going forward that we need to focus on streamlining trial startup and enrollment, simplifying contracting, IRB approvals and startup costs. In fact, early in COVID, processes that will normally take 6 months to a year were happening in a week, were happening within 2 weeks as the urgency of the moment was recognized. Unfortunately, we are already starting to go backwards in terms of how quickly we can work through issues like contracting and IRB. Third, simplifying data collection from multiple sources. We do not have a very streamlined process of integrating clinical trial data into clinical care data, enhancing the role of routine data capture, including data that's coming out of clinical care. The fifth, data, information, knowledge exchange among stakeholders. That harkens back to my comment around fragmentation. We do not have an efficient way of doing so. I will say a bright spot came out of NCATS with the CTSA programs that were able to create a platform NC3 to allow for more robust data sharing, and that's certainly a path for the future. We need to better clarify the role of tech-enabled research to support innovation so that we're not diminishing the opportunities for new tools to come forward for patients. If we go to the next topic around engagement, a lot of the discussions that have emerged on this topic have been, how do we ensure that more people can participate in our clinical trial enterprise, and then more diverse representation in our clinical enterprise as well, that goes all the way down to community level participation that reflects the needs of those communities. That we really should have clinical trials that are focused on these key approaches that are highlighted here, enhancing a user-friendliness and bridging the technical divide. I think many times, particularly when we have new uses of telemedicine or telehealth, we have to be cognizant of increasing health literacy, increasing the access to these technologies so we don't leave entire communities behind, extending the reach and reliability and reportability of clinical trials, using information and insights that are generated from those clinical trials to inform the communities in terms of issues and areas of priority to them, having processes and decision-making tools for participation, including having patients participate across the entire ecosystem, all the way from the design of the clinical trial and even to the clinical trial participation itself, lowering barriers to recruitment, working on more diverse representation, including from rural areas and for older patients as well. And then very key to all of this is having and engaging a more diverse clinical trial workforce. We're all aware that there are some, at times, cultural biases that prevent us from asking any and all eligible patients whether they'll be interested in participating. If we go on to the third slide around coordination, this was just the final theme I wanted to highlight, which is that a new vision is emerging around a need for a robust community-based clinical trial network, which is going to be dependent on having critical investment in local infrastructure and the appropriate governance to ensure that that network will respond with limited resources to key public health needs. And that if we go forward with such an approach in terms of coordination, it will really enable us to adopt these key approaches, enabling more efficient information sharing that brings in diverse voices and stakeholders, collaborative trial designs, having the appropriate level of conduct and analysis, developing tools to efficiently allocate resources. That, of course, will need a very strong governance structure. How do we identify the critical public health needs and then appropriately allocate resources there, enabling community-based partnerships where community-based partners are equal partners and there's an equal share in the value of that research information, establishing infrastructure, training, and opportunities, again, all emerged as key themes on that topic. If we go on to the next slide, I referenced earlier that another effort I've been a part of has been a US government-led effort to examine the lessons learned from COVID-19 therapeutic trials. This was spurred by the US government's involvement in Operation Warp Speed, working on the therapeutics. This was outside of the vaccine process. This is the configuration of those that were involved in this effort and the key roles here. We at Faster Cures led one of the working groups around infrastructure and resourcing. MRCT participated through Barbara, as well as a number of other partners. Not an exhaustive list, but some of those are identified here as well, that include both industry and those outside of industry. So all of that has led to a few themes that I wanted to highlight on the next slide that's emerged from this US government effort. One is the need for clear communication and engagement to all stakeholders across the clinical trial landscape, particularly researchers, patients, and developers. What we learned is that early in COVID in particular, which again is really a symptom of how our clinical trial enterprise is, that we really did not have an efficient way of communicating where research studies were happening, how patients could engage in those research studies, which were of priority for what type of patients, all of that was not shared in an efficient way for the general public. That we need to build a clinical trial infrastructure, networks, and partnerships, and keep them warm on the other issues that are critical outside of public health emergencies. NIH did a very nice job identifying networks, academic sites, and others that could be helpful for their active studies. However, as we all know, what typically happens in clinical trials is that we form a team, we come to a site, we execute a clinical trial, and then it's disbanded. So the critical need here is, how do we keep those networks focused on other public health priorities outside of a public health emergency, so that when we are experiencing a public health emergency, they are ready to go. The third is setting strategic principles, providing tools, guidelines for clinical trial design. I mentioned earlier that very effective platforms turned out to be pragmatic trials or master protocols. But again, what are the tools and the guidance there? And of course, FDA has recently commented around that to ensure that the responses can be quickly shaped from public health inception. So again, that we're not waiting to get just our ducks in a row before we start to go. The other is developing and disseminating tools and best practices to improve clinical trial execution. One of the challenges that, because of our locations, are the vast majority of our clinical trial networks, right, being really situated on both coasts. When we have opportunities for new trial sites to be up and running, they don't have all of the tools that they need. Even have model contracts, indemnification clauses, understanding where and how to tap into various types of reimbursement strategies. So all of those kinds of tools and best practices need to be developed and need to be consistently deployed. Establishing mechanisms and tools for data collection and sharing across the U.S. clinical trial ecosystem. This will need a quarterback. We do not have a single entity, U.S. government entity, responsible for the clinical trial enterprise in this country. What's needed from that perspective to enable us to share information in a seamless way. And then finally, prioritizing and resource partnering with the international community, which is very much relevant for this group, in a joint effort across regulatory bodies, that where flexibilities are provided from one regulator, those kinds of flexibilities can also be extended by others, because again, when we're dealing with companies in particular, they do not just operate in one geography. And so all of this has culminated both our efforts in terms of our lessons learned, if you go to the next slide, of Faster Cures, as well as the National Academy's effort and this U.S. government effort into some two broad areas that I think that we need to consider in terms of a vision for the future. Should we and how can we move toward a national network of clinical trials embedded in community practice? What entity should be the one to prioritize this? If it is a new entity, what should it look like? Where will funding and support for this entity come from? This will allow us to really achieve those three things that I talked about in terms of efficiency and coordination and engagement, leveraging our existing ecosystem, but building upon it to bring in more community trial sites. Importantly, we need a true north. We need to understand what are our concrete goals, what are the metrics that we're going to assign to guide us toward that North Star. The FDA tracks diversity and inclusion metrics, but as an ecosystem, we can certainly do more. But what are those metrics that we can all align on, so we do not have segmentation by industry, by community-based organizations, by academic-sponsored trials or independent investigator-led trials, but that we're all marching toward a common beat and really focused on key public health issues and challenges. And just finally, to close out, I am incredibly encouraged by the efforts that we're already seeing. If you go to the final slide there, we're seeing this accelerated move towards decentralized and hybrid trials. This really came out of the efforts for ongoing trials to stay relevant and to still be operational, and leveraging remote monitoring and other tools to enable them to keep going. How do we move toward that in the future? We have seen an industry focus on diversity in clinical trials, and that should certainly be applauded and encouraged. CROs are building more diverse trial networks. Many were stood up in response to the Moderna and the Pfizer efforts and others to try to diversify the COVID-19 vaccine trials. How do we continue to build upon that momentum? Dr. Francis Collins at NIH has announced an initiative called Unite to address structural racism in biomedical research. I think that could certainly be helpful as we think about a more diverse workforce, asking questions that are relevant to the appropriate communities. And then the other area here before the last is the US government's effort to evaluate the COVID-19 therapeutic trials also should be applauded, as the US government is taking a step back and considering what happened, what do we need to do better in the future that's relevant not just for the next, once in a lifetime event, but it's also relevant for our ongoing clinical trial network. And certainly very encouraged to see these kinds of public webinars and workshops that are being put on by multiple organizations, because again, it's helping us to really start to see where our consensus developing and where is the community moving and how we can create a new vision for the future. So thank you so much. I hope this was helpful and look forward to any questions.
Thank you so much, Esther. Barbara is having some connectivity issues, so I'm pitch hitting for her here. Really appreciate your thoughts. Incredibly thoughtful pillars of efficiency, engagement, and coordination. And very much appreciate your comments towards the end on metrics, as it's something that the MRCT Center is thinking a lot about right now. Wanted to just ask one question before we move to the first panel. Kind of the extension of the the goals of efficacy, engagement, coordination, and the national network of clinical trials. Do you have suggestions to international trials and the global preparedness?
Yes, a very, very interesting question. I mean, I think a lot of the conversation we've had today is relevant in the US context, but I do think there are learning opportunities for others. The Solidarity trial, for example, did a very nice job of getting a lot of countries signed up for that trial. What happens, however, is that it does slow things down a bit as answers need to come forward. But as those answers come forward, they're more relevant in those regional locations as well, because they're reflective of those patients who were engaged. So despite the context here being shaped around the US, I do think this movement to how do we embed trials in communities that are asking questions that are relevant to communities certainly has international implications.
Esther, thank you so much. Very much enjoyed this talk. And now I am going to move to the first panel and introduce Dr. Paul Klutz, who is a medical oncologist and Deputy Director of the Oncology Center of Excellence at the US FDA. And Paul is going to lead the group through this first panel, thinking about useful and permissible flexibilities to study conduct. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Paul Klutz again, and I'm with the Oncology Center of Excellence at the Food and Drug Administration. I'm going to see if we can get back on schedule a little bit by reducing my intro remarks, because we've got a really great panel, as you can see, really across a group of stakeholders that we want to hear from patients to commercial industry to academic researcher and to folks that are on the operational side helping out design clinical trials. So I guess I would just mention from the FDA side that, what I'm very interested in, as well as what sounds like the entire group, is to not go back to business as usual and to learn from what the efficiencies were and the patient-centeredness were that were done during the COVID pandemic. The one issue we saw very early was that there was some uncertainty with respect to the regulatory barriers to doing things like remote assessments. And I think we addressed that issue rapidly with the COVID-19 clinical trials guidance. And I think that opened up an understanding to where we could deploy some of these remote assessments, keeping safety and data integrity at the forefront. And I think a lot of trials now, as everyone knows, are being conducted in a hybrid manner, which I think has long been of interest to drug development, is how can we move clinical trials out more to where patients live. And so that's been obviously one big benefit of COVID-19 was really pushing everyone out of their comfort zones to deploy those assessments. So I think to start, I'd like to hear just some opening remarks from the panelists, a little bit of housekeeping. We would love to see questions come in, and we'll try to answer them as they come in. We won't get to them all, but I hope that we'll be able to review all of the questions afterwards so that we can identify issues. So I think I'd like to start with Fallon Kiefer, who is a patient advocate, and hear a little bit from her about what her priorities are and what she'd like to see post-pandemic. Fallon?
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here today with all of you. I've been a patient most of my life. It started at 5 years old with epilepsy and was diagnosed with polycystic kidney disease at 10 years old. Had a very challenging journey, but I'm grateful to say that this summer I'm celebrating 19 years post-kidney and 3 years post-liver transplant. And I'm just so grateful every day to be alive. And during COVID, of course, it's been very challenging to be immunosuppressed. And as a patient advocate for over 17 years, I'm very closely connected with the kidney and transplant community. And it's been quite a journey for all of us as well as everyone. But I've been lucky to be able to participate in a study during COVID, and I've learned a lot from it to be able to do all of it from home and be safe, and especially with the concerns of being high risk and during the thick of COVID and not going out and being able to be safe. I've learned a lot from it. So I think a couple of things that worked really well to share is that they sent me a blood draw kit at home and made me the access to be able to participate really easy and safe. So it was a wonderful experience of being able to do that on my own, and they scheduled pickup and everything was done virtually, and all of the information was shared via webinars, which I think was really amazing, that if I think back to times pre-COVID, that probably wouldn't have taken place. So we've been kept up to date and felt very a part of the study. And I think the participation being able to be really easy, and the communication, I think, has been just a really wonderful experience for us patients. I learned a lot, of course, from this of how important results are to patients, which I've felt that way my entire journey. But I think being able to have it shared with the community in an easy to understand language has been really empowering for all of us. As we've learned the results and feeling very in communication with the study team, I think we have felt like we're partners versus patients. And I think I've seen that shift of how good that's been for the community, of feeling like we're a part of this, we're important, we're feeling appreciated, we're learning information, it's empowering. And the thing that's been really neat to witness is the community that's come together surrounding this study. There's now social media groups about it, patients are talking, and in turn, by a really good experience in communicating online about this, recruitment's naturally happening from patients talking about it to other patients. My thought moving forward, thinking of going through a decentralized study during COVID, and with the COVID clinical trials and just being immunosuppressed, it makes me think moving forward on parallel studies. I feel like the immunosuppressed community, we feel like months behind the general public because of not being included in the initial COVID trials. So we didn't have any information on safety or efficacy of the vaccine. And it leaves us now that just several months ago, we learned that it's not as effective in our community. And now yesterday, I live in California, and all mandates were lifted for masks and social distancing. And I feel like I'm months behind that because we're still learning how to proceed moving forward and what's safe to integrate ourselves back into society. So I think it would have been amazing if there could have been, that we could have been included, if there would have been an option to do maybe a parallel study with the general public and those that have a compromised immune system. And I think that, I think through the big thing through all of this is just witnessing, I think, the power of partnerships with patients and study teams. And I'm just really grateful to be able to share the patient perspective today, and that I hope that it helps moving forward to create positive change.
Thank you, Valen. You know, now I think we'll move over and hear some opening remarks from Isaac Rodriguez Chavez, who's a former FDA colleague and friend of mine, and now has moved over to more of the operations sides with PRA Health Sciences. So Isaac, opening remarks.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you all the organizers of this event for the opportunity to be with all of you here. Welcome all of you participants to this conference and event. I am delighted to be here with all of you. Opening remarks is that we are really in a transitional and transformational times in clinical research. These are exciting times for everyone to be engaged in clinical investigations, and essentially the future is really bright. There are opportunities to think outside of the box, and what I look forward is we are just at the beginning of many, many good and exciting things to happen from the clinical research standpoint that will definitely benefit all the stakeholders, clearly the patients, the sponsors, the sites, the investigators, the different healthcare providers engaged in the clinical investigations. This is a great opportunity to deliver at a very high caliber quality, maintain the safety of the participants, and have really the integrity of the data that is needed for assessing the safety and efficacy of the medical products under investigation. So the future is really bright, and I am looking forward to being part of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Isaac. I will turn it over now for a little bit of an academic investigator insight by Lindsay Baden. And you know, I think Lindsay, you know, it's interesting, and I think Penny has the same perspective that I'm specific to oncology, but you have a broad range of therapeutic area, interest with respect to clinical trials. And so I know the context is important. So opening remarks from you, Lindsay.
Oh, no, thank you. And I'd like to thank the organizers for bringing us together for this terrific and important discussion. And I'm going to amplify what's already been said, because I think we've touched on a lot of the key issues. I'm the PI of the NIH Moderna study. So over the last 18 months, spent a lot of time watching things unfold and helping figure out how do we do something that hasn't been done before in the shadow of a pandemic that shut down society, shut down how we interact, and we all were fearful for our own health. Yet we needed to respond to this. We didn't have PPE, we didn't have diagnostic tests, we didn't understand the pathogen. And I think that part of the lessons, to just highlight a couple of key lessons or themes that I'm sure we'll touch on some more, data sharing. You know, back on January 10th, 11th, 2020, having the sequence available globally made a difference to everybody in thinking about how to respond. And that data sharing is a very important element that we have to think about. The regulatory framework. How do we do studies? How do we think about it? Are the different considerations, be they vaccines, monoclonals, small molecules, anti-inflammatories, do they really have the same metronomes and issues? In fact, did we even understand the disease pathogenesis to know which of those things mattered in our response? Did we have diagnostic tests, antibody, PCR? We're still improving that. And so I think that we had to figure out how to design the studies. What would the endpoints be? What would the clinical trials look like? How would we do home assessments? What could we do through the mail or in person to make sure that we kept the volunteers safe while we answered the questions with the technology available, because we understood the disease? And I think that's a very important element, is the rapidity of understanding the pathogen and the rapidity of engaging the clinical trials network and stakeholders. And this really was a partnership between academia, the government, the industry, the regulatory, and community, and we all rallied together with much uncertainty to say what actually makes sense to go forward to be able to do the pivotal studies. Many of the studies did not yield the result we wanted. Some of them did yield the result we wanted, and we have to be prepared for both success and failure. And in fact, there'll be a lot more failure than success in terms of things working. And how do we enable, engage, and accelerate that iterative process? And then the last comment is just equity, which I think we all are reflecting on in terms of disproportionality of disease impact, but also of how we do our studies to make sure it's relevant to the communities that are impacted, as Dr. Krofer very eloquently framed in the opening remarks. But I think there's a lot that we can do together and have done together, and I think there's much for us to think about and learn from this.
Thanks, Lindsay. And I think it's so important, the point you made, that there are many more failures than there are successes if you're doing science correctly. And the question is, how can we get to those results as fast as possible so that we can screen through all the failures to find those truly effective therapies? And the other point, I think, is this collaboration and data sharing. What are the incentives for that moving forward? I think is really important. So we're going to end as far as the introductions with Penny Carlson, who's with Takeda, and so she can bring us, boots on the ground, industry, commercial experience. What has been your perspective? What do you think about the COVID-19 pandemic and what we can learn?
Thanks, Paul. So thanks for having me here today. I mean, I think what everyone here is hearing is that no matter the perspective, whether it be an investigator, someone from a CRO or a regulator, a patient, or someone from a sponsor company, is that I see opportunity everywhere. I think it took us a little bit to get through the immediate challenges of the pandemic and turn those into opportunities. And I think that all of you have mentioned a lot of those opportunities. We have seen significant focus and opportunity in terms of diversity in clinical trials, and that's diversity of all sorts. I think we'll talk through some of that throughout the panel today. There's opportunity for collaboration, which we did not see prior to the pandemic in the same way. And that's about how we collaborated with each other as sponsor companies, for example, how we collaborated with our sites, and how we collaborated with regulators. I think we've all learned so much. I think as a human being, as a parent, as an employee of a sponsor company, all those different perspectives are really important in terms of what it is that we've done to respond to the pandemic. But we have a long way to go, and I think that we have a lot to do to take everything that we've done, all the ways in which we responded to the pandemic, and keep that momentum going and really change the way that we work. And that could be about how it is that we work with sites to get ready to do research faster. It could be about how we offer access to clinical trials to patients who really need a different kind of access to healthcare. And it could be about how quickly we're able to get information to regulators in order to get to the next phase and give a much more broad population access to the treatments or the vaccines.
Great, thank you very much. So what I'd like to do is open this up to more of a panel discussion. We'll also take some questions and answers. I know one's come in that actually is interesting that could maybe get us all started, that I think we can all comment on. Surrounding incentives. What is the incentive to continue to do things as they were done? That could be with respect to data sharing. It could be with respect to companies collaborating on sort of trials with a shared control arm. That's a challenge in oncology that we'd love to see improve. But the question specifically is patients. And when we're doing remote assessments or we're delivering remote investigational product, which has happened during COVID, how can we incentivize patients to take the drug as it was prescribed, or to fill out that electronic patient-reported outcome, or whatever the clinical outcome assessment is that's being done remotely? So maybe I'll start with Valen. What do you think as a patient would incentivize, because a lot of this is going to be put on the patients if it is going to be so remote. What do you think will motivate patients to try to complete the assessments, to make sure that they're taking the drug as prescribed, et cetera? Oh, I think you're muted, Valen.
Thank you. I have seen how important it is for patients to hear from patients. And I think if there's an initiative and it opens up some type of a community, and I think if if there's some type of a connection, like if I was participating in a clinical trial, but I was able to talk to maybe other patients that were doing it, or I was even able to be educated on it from other patients. I think that one-on-one is so important for us to be able to hear from someone else that has gone through the same thing. And so I think if it's almost like it's an opportunity, you can participate in a clinical trial and you're also opening up this community you're going to be a part of, and you feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself, and you see the outcome and how you can help. I think that that's really powerful. I think that that would be really important. And I think that's what patients want right now. We want to be a part of something big, so we know we're creating positive change for future generations, so they don't have to go through what we're going through.
Now, Isaac, as someone who's responsible for data quality within, clinical research organization, let's say, what are some of the things that you've done to help monitor and make sure that, for instance, adherence to an electronic PRO or some patient-generated data is high quality?
Well, it will only take me 2 weeks to answer your question, but let me just give you a quick introduction to it. Thank you, Paul, for the question, very important. In the first place, I would say when you look at the incentives, and let me go back to your initial question, or your previous question, we need to look at this from the different and multiple stakeholders. The patient's perspectives are different compared to the sponsor's perspectives, and the site's perspectives, and each of these stakeholders have important incentives in place to do things in a different way. Patients want something that is transformative, something that is meaningful, something that is less intrusive, something that is really going to provide a benefit for them that is tangible. Now we're talking about patients in clinical trials. We also have healthy people in clinical trials. Think about a prophylactic vaccine, now that we're in the era of the COVID-19 vaccines. So these individuals are just not infected with with COVID-19. They are just being volunteers, if you will, in clinical investigations, and they may see the benefits, but these are participants. These are not necessarily patients. So there are different incentives created for different sectors of people involved and stakeholders involved in the clinical investigation. The sponsors are looking for something that is more tangible, more efficient in all steps of the clinical investigation, that is cost control, if not cheaper, and that maintains the safety and the efficacy of, maintains the safety and the data quality of the clinical investigation. The sites are looking for, evidently, how do we generate revenue when we have less people? And can we do this in a meaningful way so that it doesn't represent losses? Because otherwise our silver lining is compromised. Nowadays, many sites understand that the more efficiency and integration, limiting or eliminating the geographic barriers, represent more opportunities. And so there is a transformation of the expenses and the revenue generation at the site level that is different, for example, in decentralized trials and modern clinical trials compared to what happened in a traditional clinical investigation. Payers are looking at the same, different efficiencies and different ways of billing, so an acceptability of multiple activities in the clinical research and the digital healthcare enterprise, so that things can be transformed. That's why I use the word transformational in all senses. Now, going back to your second question, I could say we need to, DCTs enabled by digital health technologies, again, offer a unique opportunity, a historical opportunity to do things differently. There is a lot more integration of multidisciplinary teams within an organization, and there is a lot more integration of different organizations and stakeholders to put together a simple DCT. And Penny alluded to this. The collaboration and the level of collaborations and the types of collaborations that nowadays has to be put in place to deliver quality, excellence, and control the quality and integrity of the data and maintain the safety of the participants is unprecedented. And all of this needs to be mapped out very carefully early on, even before a trial is, a protocol is written. So there is a whole deck of people and stakeholders and functional units, medical, scientific, quality control, quality assurance, regulatory, legal, operations, that have to really work in synchrony to make it happen. Another thing is, in all of this, we engage early on with the participants, because, and participants mean participants and patients, because nowadays it's more than ever a partnership. It's not the passive position of the participants in the traditional clinical trials. Is more of an empowerment position and partnership position. They are vested in understanding, with all of the technologies that exist, what is happening with their health, what is the result of the clinical laboratory that was an endpoint or is an endpoint for the clinical investigation that is happening. So all of this is very important. And mapping out the data from the end, the beginning, to the very end, and how the data will flow, and what is the health journey that the participants will follow. What kind of technologies will be customized and adapted for the specific needs of that trial? What kind of digital endpoints will be utilized? Can they be utilized to meet the specific needs of that specific DCT?
Yeah, there's no doubt that there's going to need to be a lot of infrastructure. That was actually brought up a little bit in the introductory comments, which I thought were great. By the way, I'd love to see the slide deck from our speaker in the very beginning, because it was just fantastic, Dr. Krofa. So, you know, for Lindsay and for Penny, the whole idea of decentralized trials, and actually from what we've heard from Valen, the idea of patients participating more really actually is an exciting opportunity. But what are the data integrity issues that we have to think about? The more that you put some of these very highly controlled endpoints and data sourcing to patients, you know, there's nothing for free. So you may get some variability. You may have some challenges there. What are some of the things that would be considerations for the patient-generated data, and how have you overcome that in some of the trials that you've done? Maybe we'll start with Lindsay and then go to Penny.
No, I mean, I think that understanding the perspective of the other, which is what you're getting at with incentive, is for you to participate in my trial, I have to understand your perspective, what motivates you, what you're able to do, willing to do, interested in doing, and we have to align the incentives so everybody wins. And there's no reason not to. And so that's the macroscopic, do the incentives align in a way that lead us all to a virtuous resolution. And then what you're getting at, Paul, is the issue of advancing technology. Now that we all have, I shouldn't say we all, now that many of us have smartphones, and smartphones are cheap enough that they could all be incorporated into clinical studies. We can do pulse, oxygen level monitoring, heart rate monitoring, online questionnaires, daily diaries, the CDC vaccine surveillance after, just examples of things which could not have existed 20 years ago. That now I am an investigator, but I'm also a patient, a participant, a vaccine recipient, because I'm at risk for COVID like the rest of us on this call. And so being able to engage me in a way where I can respond in a way that fits my lifestyle, but adds to the data robustness, completeness, and being able to engage all of us. And I think that's really important. I think we have to adapt to the technologies. And it gets back to the equity concept, in that there are those communities that don't have access to some of these devices. And that is something we have to build into how we think about doing these studies, because we really, for things that affect all of us, we have to engage all of us, and we need to leverage technology to engage all of us, and that's doable. So it's imminently doable. It's a solvable logistic problem. We just have to think it through. But I think engaging the technology and making it part of the study design and having the volunteers, participants be thought about in the creation of those data acquisition elements so that we're able to include the rural communities that don't have very good Wi-Fi, certain communities that don't have smart devices. That's all solvable. We just have to think it through. But that is the way of the future, in my view.
Yeah, and I just would, before going to Penny, I would mention that there are some things that are within our regulatory purview, and then there's a lot of things that we have to do as a country and as a sort of ecosystem to improve. One of them is just digital infrastructure, but there's also these efficiencies like IRB and contracting, which is sort of also outside of our wheelhouse. But Penny, tell me about, when you're running a trial and you're going to be putting in some significant resources to get an answer that's robust enough to present to the agency. How do you think about incentivizing, and how do you think about what I guess Lindsay was saying, that now we may have many, many more data sources, and maybe there'll be some more directionality, but not as much pure, rigor within a single source?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question that was relevant even before COVID-19, right? When we think about the number of indications where patient-reported outcomes are so critical to understand efficacy or the ultimate endpoint of a particular clinical trial, it's only intensified. And I think part of the incentivization has to be just about appealing to humanity, right? I have to assume that was a significant part of why these vaccine trials were able to enroll as quickly as they were, right? It was about the greater good. It was a little bit about possibly having access to something before the general population. So some of them might have been about access, at least a chance at access, right? We can't guarantee effectiveness, and we certainly can't guarantee, which of the vaccines or placebo you would get. But I think there's a significant humanity part there, and I think also helping patients to understand why a particular piece of data might be important, it would also be helpful. I don't think any human wants to go into the effort of doing something and trudge into a hospital, in Boston during a Red Sox game, trying to, and then find out that you didn't get the right data to answer the questions that you needed to answer, right? So I think some of that is just sort of appealing to basic humanity and making sure that patients truly understand what they're getting into and why their participation and why that data point is so important. Because I think many of us are in indications and therapeutic areas where without that patient-reported data, we have nothing. So that's it in terms of the incentivization piece. And I think in terms of data integrity, I do think that is the one sort of big question. It's sort of the big black box out there in terms of what will this look like in a year or two in terms of data integrity. When we think about capturing information via a telehealth visit, is there variability that we don't yet understand in terms of how it is that a physician would assess a patient via telehealth versus actually having a patient in your office, right? I mean, Lindsay, you'd be much better equipped to answer that question than I, but I have to assume that there'd be some level of variability in terms of how it is that we get that. But I think we need to understand that and then work with, we need to collaborate as sponsor companies. We need to work with regulators to understand what the tolerance for that variability is. And then the last point I would make is that we as an industry have been focused on quality by design for a very long time. And I think we need to shift and add to that list flexibility by design. And we need to understand, is there a patient actually who would much prefer to go into a site every time because they want access to that physician and those nurses? Or is there somebody who lives 5 hours away but wants access to the clinical trial and wants to participate and give their time, but can't possibly get in there every time? That goes back to the variability question, of course, right? But that's why the collaboration is so important between patients, sponsors, and regulators.
Penny, Valen, do you want to respond just briefly to what I think was a really interesting point, which is something that we always think we know what patients want until we actually ask patients, and then they surprise us 50% of the time. One of the things I always thought patients wanted was, well, of course you want to stay at home and hang with your own home healthcare system, and it's going to be so much more convenient. But we have heard that is absolutely not true. Some patients really do value that face-to-face contact at the site. So what do you think about that? What's your perspective?
I agree. And I feel like I was just doing this the whole time because everything all of you were saying, I was like, yes, yes, and yes. And I do think I love, Penny, you said about flexibility, because I understand the value of data and the integrity of that. But I do think we're all humans. So we're naturally have different, desires. So I think if there could be a bit more flexibility, it would be huge. Because as an example, I had to travel out of state to get my liver transplant. I went to Barnes-Jewish Hospital. After a year, I was able to keep my care in California. I still travel to Barnes-Jewish Hospital because I trust them so much and I want that in person. So you are going to find people that want that in-person human connection. And then you're going to find people that want to participate but might be too sick and can't travel, and it's really important for them to be a part of this study. It could be a drug, for instance, with PKD that's going to slow hopefully the progression of their disease, but they're too sick to do the travel and in person. So it's really important for them to participate too. So I think if we can evolve into some form of just a greater flexibility, but still try and, of course, have integrity in our data, I think that would be huge success. You're going to reach the most amount of people. And I really think it's key if you can have patients involved from the beginning. Just figure out what's important to them. And I think the education is huge. They need to be educated and understand the value of it and why it's important for not only themselves, but like was said, humanity as a whole. And all of this is just so great. I'm excited for the future. It's just been amazing to be a patient from a child till now and see all that's evolved. And now the patient voice matters. It didn't when I was a kid. So this is just exciting. The future is exciting.
Let me chime in 1 second, Paul, because I think this discussion is really exciting. So I believe that the beauty of one of the beauties of decentralized clinical trials really is they offer the opportunity to think outside of the box and add levels of flexibility or flexibilities to the trials, accounting for variabilities or sources of variabilities and bias, customizing technologies to make it fit for purpose, and essentially accounting from the very beginning until the very end, all of these factors so that there are opportunities to do things in a different way. Again, this is a historical transformation and we are able to make it. It's an experiment and we are all part of this experiment. I think it's on our hands to account from the very beginning those flexibilities, build those flexibilities in the protocols, otherwise it's just not going to happen. And then how do you account for sources of variabilities, sources of bias? And at the same time, as Lindsay mentioned, we need to think about enhancing the diversity pool in the clinical investigations. That is also an important factor. And the expectation really is from the FDA, and as a former colleague and an official, really is to enhance the diversity of the pool participating in clinical trials. It doesn't happen for free. It really has to be planned proactively and streamline processes and procedures, adapting technologies so that we really enhance the participation of everyone. Equity is really important with flexibilities. Thank you.
Lindsay, go ahead. I
think it's getting the issue of communication. And we have to really think deeply about that because it's not one size fits all. There isn't one prototypic patient for COVID. And something we learned, and Dr. Krofa sort of highlighted it, was as we were doing the vaccine studies, there were very educated communities who were beating down the door. So no communication was necessary. They were front and center. And then there were communities that were very suspicious of the establishment. And for us to be successful, all communities who are at risk for this disease, which is all of us, had to be engaged, which meant the communication was very different and required very different strategies, personnel, and tactics to be able to overcome some of the historical hostilities that, I could argue we had nothing to do with, but had everything to do with. And I think that communication is part of what we have to think through very deeply to make sure that when we do our studies, we're really engaging all the communities at risk for the disease and therefore help us understand that the solutions we come up with really work for the communities affected, not just the communities who are most accessible.
So Lindsay, what you said is really important. Where I work, we actually follow a multi-pronged approach or approaches to reach diverse communities and actually add cultural competencies. And that is what you're saying. It's just not only reaching everyone with one size fits all, but it's actually adding that meaningful communication piece to different communities with different social behaviors so that the message resonates with different communities in different places. And doing it in multiple ways, in different multimedia, using different approaches.
Couple interesting, I mean, some are comments, some are questions coming in through the Q&A. One of the things that actually came to my mind as well as Valen was talking about how the patient communities want to speak to each other and want to become a community while they're on a clinical trial. That has benefits in that patients feel invested. Patients may actually encourage each other on completion and on adhering to protocols, et cetera. But what are the challenges to bias and to affecting potentially outcomes? Because there could be some, and I was going to see maybe if Penny and Lindsay wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment first, and Penny can fill in. Having patients communicate with each other, support each other, communicate with the investigative team to improve the study, very important, but there are huge privacy considerations. And there are real challenges because during the course of a study, surprises may emerge and individuals may or may not want that shared with others. So one has to just be very thoughtful to enable communication so we can improve the support of the participants as well as to help us improve the study. Maybe the way in which we're sampling something can be done better and we can actually do a protocol change to improve how the study is conducted. But we have to be incredibly sensitive to individual privacy and unexpected issues that may emerge that we have to be very respectful of.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I mean, I think I would argue that in fact, this may happen informally anyway. So irrespective of if it's sanctioned by the folks who are running the clinical trial, I think it probably happens informally. And there's inherent risk in that even. I think we, most people are really trying to understand how do you understand something that might be shared on a forum or on Facebook or on social media relative to a clinical trial. And I think we see it on a really regular basis. So I do think that the privacy issue is one that should be noted. And that's really in all areas of what we're talking about here as we think about new technology, innovation, telehealth visits, transferring data from an Apple Watch to some other device that goes to ultimately to a sponsor. Do we have the right mechanisms in place to ensure data privacy, particularly in areas of the world where data privacy regulations are even stronger than they are here in the US? So I think we touched on a whole lot of topics here that I think are important to what we're talking about.
On the sharing and what can we learn side of things, I think you brought up something, Penny, that's very interesting. An interest of mine is that, where the rubber hits the road, industry's biggest concern is variability, especially as relates to the primary efficacy endpoint of a clinical trial. And I think we should all be concerned about that because we don't want an effective drug being shown to be ineffective, or we don't want some bias introduced that shows an ineffective drug being ineffective. So the primary endpoint is so important. What are folks doing, industry, CROs, academia, to look at the information that's coming from this, grand experiment of hybrid decentralization, and how can we look at that data to see where is the variability? In oncology, one of the things is getting CT scans locally versus at Memorial Sloan Kettering, for instance. What are you giving up? I mean, most people have high technology CT scans at this point, but are there some scans that don't go low enough and therefore become uninterpretable? We don't know. I'd like to know what that is, and I think that that's an opportunity for the whole system to start to look at their data. Have you begun to look at that, Lindsay, Penny, Isaac, and if so, what have you found?
I mean, Paul, just to frame it, if you look at the primary scale for COVID outcome, the WHO 7-point scale, maybe the NIH 8-point scale, boy, is it crude. It's crude. You know, do you need oxygen? Are you in the ICU? Are you fully functional? It's very qualitative. And the question is, how is that endpoint or that scale to be used? Is it used globally for trials everywhere where there may be no infrastructure and electricity is uncertain? Is it only at high resourced academic centers? And I think that all of the above can make sense, but then they require different scales and different ways of assessing. And if the outcome is mortality, that's easier to assess in any context. If the outcome is your degree of hypoxemia during a 24-hour period with a continuous monitoring, because perhaps that gives a better insight, that can be done at home and it can be done in a reliable way, but does it actually reflect the disease pathogenesis that is interruptible with the intervention of interest? So I think it's a very important question. Oncology and infectious disease have different metronomes, and academic centers and global assessment have different challenges. And that just has to be incorporated into what is the study trying to do and what is accessible in a time frame that's relevant.
Yeah, those are really excellent points, and I think that most of the companies that are probably represented here are asking those same questions. And I think we almost have a study within our studies right now. So what we tried to do at Takeda was for any study that was impacted by COVID, which was all of them essentially in one way or another, if there were assessments that needed to be done locally that would ordinarily have been done by a central lab, for example, or central imaging company or a central rater, we tried to understand and collect data about how those assessments were in fact collected during the pandemic so that we can go back and look, do we have variability? Do we understand any differences that we might observe based on the method of assessment, if it was local or based on that central imaging vendor, for example. And I think we don't have that information just yet, but I do think it's a question we're actively answering. And again, that's one of the things that we'll all learn, and hopefully we'll share with each other about what is that variability that we observed during the pandemic, and does it matter, and is it impactful in terms of the overall endpoints, across any number of indications or therapeutic areas.
So in my case, we have data scientists and we have analytics in place for each of these trials so that we can actually assess per protocol and in real time when there is an outlier and investigate the reasons for that outlier to be happening. The outlier can be a safety signal, or the outlier can be a bad health outcome just because there was an error in processing or in a lab endpoint. So we investigate in as real time as possible, and we have the capacity to do so because there is data integration through the technology that we use, and there is a foundational architectural technology that is utilized, and as I said, is all mapped out, how the data will flow from the very beginning until the very end, and how the data is looked at so that we can actually take corrective measures in almost real time and essentially understand the sources of the variability, the sources of the reasons why an outlier might be happening, and put in place corrective measures before too long. Doing it timely, doing it per protocol is important, but also doing it on a holistic basis because the services are offered from end to end. It's not just a point solution. It's not just to look at one particular outlier. One of the beauties of DCTs really is that we have the opportunity to collect data more continuously or 24/7, if you will. It depends on what is decided per protocol, and the idea of collecting specific health outcomes gives us the opportunity to have a more holistic view from the health perspective for each of these participants, as compared to, for example, the episodic data that we used to get with traditional clinical investigations. That is very powerful. That can never be obtained in traditional clinical investigations. And even if there will be sources of variability and some level of variability, we can account for those levels of variability, and we need to understand what will be acceptable by the regulatory agencies, because all of these testings that we're doing for safety and efficacy, enhancing the convenience of the participants, is happening in the real world setting.
Well, let me mention this. I think, and I do want to reorient everyone to the time. It's going to be 11:25. We're supposed to end at 11:30, and I think it'd be a fun exercise towards the end to have everyone focus on the one thing that they hope will be maintained, and then maybe one challenge you think that's in the way of it being maintained. But let me just wrap up a couple of the themes that I thought were really interesting. To Isaac's point, continuous monitoring is actually something that is probably going to be happening with decentralization. If you're using more digital technologies, you're going to have signals in between clinic visits. So what's most important is that we randomize, if we're doing a hybrid design and we're doing sort of being flexible and letting patients, one visit be in clinic, the next visit's remote, the next, which is happening, and I think that's fine. It needs to be randomized, and what we will look at, and we should look at scientifically, is that it's balanced, because it's clearly going to be different. I mean, it's ascertainment bias if you're going to ask someone every day how they're feeling versus once every month. So I think we want to randomize. We want to make sure that we start to report in trials what percentage of patients had remote assessments on each arm and make sure that it's balanced. I think that's something we can do. The second thing is, what do we learn from the data that we're getting as we get it in? If ever there was a time to data share, to Lindsay's point, it would be, what do we know about the variability of different kinds of remote assessments, and how can we all learn from that? Because I think what we're going to find is in COVID, whatever the variability is probably the worst it's going to be, because we were deploying these on the fly. We didn't try to mitigate things and know what we were going to be running up against. So I think we can do it better in the future. And the last is, I just want to say to Valen's point that I do think that the right approach is probably a flexible approach to allow the patient to determine whether they want to come to clinic or whether they want to stay remotely. Again, as long as it's all randomized and that there's equal assessments between it. Last one is a plug. We are interested in learning from COVID, and so we've actually asked industry who are submitting cancer clinical trial data sets from commercial trials to standardize some of how they've done remote versus clinic visits, so that we can start to look at and aggregate our data and maybe help the community by providing some insights as well. And that's on the Oncology Center of Excellence website called Learning from Decentralized Trials. So to end, and maybe we'll be just a slightly over, but I'd love to hear from each person the one thing they'd love to maintain from what we had to do during COVID-19, and one of the issues that may be a barrier that we should start to work on to overcome it. And I think we'll, as always, start with the patient. Valen.
Okay, so one thing to maintain going forward, I think the ease of participation. I've seen how powerful that was, how many people could be able to get involved in the study because it was accessible to them from home, not having to go anywhere, completely safe, no questions asked. It was, we all wanted to be a part of it. And just partnerships with patients. It's huge. It's what's going to evolve to as many people as possible being able to be a part of it, to successful trials, because you're going to talk to patients right off the bat and know what they want, and the success of it will be huge. I think an opportunity, I'll say, going forward. I think there's a great opportunity to build on education. When you think of this past year, the whole world heard about trials. It was in the forefront of all of us in the news. And so people that don't even have any health issues, they learned something about it. So we've got this platform now. I think we should just build upon that and be able to educate others on the importance of it and to reach different communities. Because I felt earlier, what was shared is how I feel, is that I'm active in the community, so I stay up to date. But what about the transplant recipients that aren't active in the communities? How do we reach them? How do we get outside our communities is what I've been trying to think of through COVID. How do I reach the patients that aren't a part of the organizations I'm involved with that need this information, that need to know clinical trials are available, they need to know the results. So I think, of course, so many amazing things were done. Listening to all of you, I have full confidence we are able to do anything with extraordinary people like you in the positions to help patients. And I'm just really grateful. And I really think that there's a bright future ahead for patients. And I'm excited to still be alive today to witness it all and hopefully play a positive role in all of it. So thank you for including the patient voice today. I'm really honored to be here.
Thanks, Fallon. Isaac, take a deep breath and one question. You can only do it in one breath, though.
So, very quickly. So I would say one thing that we haven't discussed today is, and that I would like to see going forward, is the maintenance of the unification of utilization of the standard healthcare system and clinical research as a care option. Why? Because our health journey is one. We participate in clinical research, we participate and we take advantages of the standard healthcare system. If we do DCTs as clinical research option and integrate it with the standard healthcare system, we as humans, subjects, individuals will be better served. In terms of the challenges, and this is something that we are implemented in PRA Health Sciences, but it's something that the field at large will probably embrace, because our health as individuals is one. It's not divided into clinical research and the standard healthcare system. The challenge most definitely is the regulatory challenge, because we need to harmonize the different regulatory frameworks according to different regulatory agencies to be able to conduct DCTs in a more meaningful, smooth way globally.
Right.
The GDPR in Europe is a challenge. APAC is up and coming. 41% of new trials since 2018 are conducted in the Asia Pacific region. Yet we need the regulatory landscape there.
So let me take that's just to reiterate, it's a global clinical trial enterprise that we are in and we will continue to be in. And there is one FDA that speaks for US and there's many other regulatory agencies. And I think that's a great point we didn't bring up as a challenge, particularly hard to overcome challenge, but I think we are already interacting globally with regulators to see.
So thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for sharing all of this information with all of you. Hopefully we will get to harmonize all of these regulatory frameworks across the different agencies and to conduct the CTs globally.
Thanks, Isaac.
Thank
Lindsay,
you.
what's your grand hope and what's the challenge that's we have to overcome to get there?
We were able to create therapies in under a year. So all of the challenges we've talked about were overcome, period. We need that same urgency for all the other diseases. We have to step back from SARS-CoV-2 exceptionalism to what can we do? What have we learned that we can then bring to bear for all the other things our patients are suffering from, and have that same sense of urgency and to leverage what was done because it demonstrates what can be done. So I think that we have to, safety and speed are not at odds. They can and have been done together, and we need to communicate. So we need to communicate our ability to do what we have done and to continue to build on it. Science works, safety and speed work together, and we need to have that collective sense of urgency to overcome and address the diseases our patients have.
Well said. Penny, the last panelist standing.
Yes, and I'll try to be brief. I think there's one word that sums it up for me, and that's the collaboration, because I think it covers what we did with patients, what we've done with regulators, what we've done as sponsors working with each other, what we've done working with our vendors. It speaks to the communication with the media. It speaks to cross-border collaboration. And I think it was unparalleled. I mean, we've never seen that kind of collaboration before. We've never shared data with each other the way that we have in the last year and a half. And I think that it's really opened the industry's eyes in terms of what's possible, the ways in which we should be working, not just because we had to, but because we can and because we should. So it's collaboration every step of the way.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the conveners of this for inviting me and my fellow panelists. I think you guys did a great job. I thought we learned a lot, and I will stop so that people can get a coffee and a 7-minute break before the next session.
Paul, thank you so much. And Valen, Penny, Isaac, and Lindsay, thank you so much for the thoughtful discussion and the questions and the conversation. This has really been a wonderful hour. So as Paul said, we are going to take a 10-minute break now. And so we will see you all back here at 11:44. Thank you so much. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We hope you had a good 10-minute break and kind of let all of the amazing conversation digest from the first panel. I am very pleased to introduce our moderator for our second panel. If we could just put the slides one more ahead. Thank you. Perfect. The second panel is really going to discuss and think about the implications for and the need to reimagine the workforce. And I am very pleased to introduce Craig Lipset, who is the co-chair of the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, the vice chair of the MedStar Health Research Institute, the vice president for the Foundation for Sclerosis Research, and on the editorial board for therapeutic innovation and regulatory science. Over to you, Craig.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here, and especially to build on the fantastic conversation that we've had so far with both Esther as well as the first panel today. Clearly, the changes coming out of clinical trials after the pandemic are real, and they're here. And as we've been discussing so far, whether those hit on decentralization, flexibility for participation, other supporting areas such as how we monitor our trials in fresh and different ways. And as Esther opened with, how do we enhance our support for diversity and inclusion in our trials? But one thing we do know is that change does not sustain simply because we did it with urgency during a pandemic. We know that change requires commitment in terms of looking at our policies, looking at our partners, looking at our culture, and importantly, looking at our workforce. Without those sustaining changes, there's no confidence that we're not going to just go back to the comfort of how we've done things before. And so I'm looking forward to a conversation with this panel as we build on the morning so far and start to talk about reimagining our workforce. And while I'm, of course, looking forward to our panelists, I'm also looking forward to hearing from all of you. And so please keep your questions coming, and we'll be sure to weave those into the conversation together. With that, I would like to welcome the individuals you see on your screen. Nicholas Brook, with patient-focused medicine development. Andrea Ferris, the president and CEO of Longevity. Andy Lee, who's the senior vice president and head of global clinical trial operations at Merck. And Harpreet Singh, who is with the Division of Oncology at the US FDA. Welcome to you all. Well, to get our conversation started, and I will want to make sure this will be my casual way of making sure that my panelists are all connected and their microphones are all working. I'd like to invite each of you to share an opening perspective of just 2 or 3 minutes on the topic of reimagining our workforce to support the future of clinical trials. Nicholas, would you mind getting us started?
Thank you, Craig, and hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So, yes, I'm part of patient-focused medicine development, and our focus is really to design the best way to integrate the patient voice at all stages in the life cycle of medicine. And so that's with that perspective that I come to this panel. And I think we heard it several times. Lindsay finished his closing remark with that comment, and you said it just now, Craig. It's not us making the change. The crisis pushed us in the back to make this change happen. And so it really raises key question in terms of the skills and the workforce we have, because we didn't do it because we wanted to do it, but we did it because we had to do it. So the first question is that with the skill set we have today, can we even maintain and sustain the change that we reach, and can we extend it? So yes, we have a really great progress. I think it has been very well articulated across the previous session. Telemedicine, complex, decentralized, hybrid trials, all the digital aspects of it, the shift to patient centricity, and I think we should also say the shift to user centricity if we use more of a digital language. So yes, all of that is happening. We don't know yet on how it will crystallize and what will be the next normal, because we hear plenty of people that want to build on that, and I'm part of them. We also hear plenty of people that want to get back to normal. So I think there are really some key questions we need to act upon if we want to make sure that we anchor the progress that we have made to date. And so I think what I witness is that we are facing converging trends. Digital, a whole new space to make it happen, many new questions, and all the aspects of remote trials, all of that is new. And so actually what we are doing is that we are adding to the complexity that was already in place before the crisis and the pandemic. So what I'd like to see and discuss today is how we will check how we address or we maintain the solutions that we have put in place and we scale it to other conditions. That's one. How we continue to address issues that were there before that are still there today: diversity, data sharing, access to clinical trials. So all these questions that are still very true. And so then, and I know we'll discuss that a little bit later, but what agility, what type of agility we need. And just to, as a trigger, and Esther mentioned the North Star earlier in the introduction. And I really believe that the North Star and our agility will have to be qualified through the patient lens. And so that's what I would like to discuss a bit further today.
Thank you, Nicholas. Some fabulous points there. And I love this call out that while there are a number of important and technical capabilities we'll be discussing as part of our workforce going forward, what are those other mindsets and other changes that we need so that we can adapt quickly for other capabilities we simply can't anticipate today, but certainly saw how important that capability was over the last year. Andrea, do you have 2 or 3 minutes of opening perspective on this topic of workforce for the emerging clinical trial landscape?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. First, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I am President and CEO of Longevity Foundation. We are a US-based lung cancer patient advocacy group. And I very much like what Nicholas was just talking about in terms of an agile workforce. But I think also as we are, thinking about decentralizing clinical trials, bringing them closer to the patient, for a variety of reasons, most, patient centricity, but also engagement of diverse and underserved populations as well. I think from a workforce perspective, we need to think more broadly and amply about what that workforce is. It's not just the people designing the clinical trials, the clinicians who are implementing it, but all of the different players and stakeholders who interact with patients as well, and can help to enable or navigate through the system. So I think as we are talking about decentralizing trials and reimagining the workforce, I encourage all of us to just have a much more ample mindset when thinking about what that workforce is and who that encompasses.
Great perspective. Thank you, Andrea. Some great points we'll get back to. Andy Lee, welcome. Do you have some opening thoughts on the workforce for our future, given some of these changes? I'm not sure if Andy was able to reconnect after the break. So I will, let's see if maybe Sarah and the team are able to check on Andy and his whereabouts. And in the meantime, we'll shift over to Harpreet. Harpreet Singh, welcome. Opening perspective.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm Harpreet Singh. I'm a medical oncologist and I direct one of our 3 solid tumor divisions within the FDA. And my division in particular houses all the thoracic cancer, so very active area of investigation. When I wanted to kind of pull from panel 1 and then kind of take that into this idea of reimagining the workforce. One thing that, I've heard a term I've heard a lot is agility and flexibility. And we certainly need that when thinking about what the workforce looks like. But just to back it up for a moment, the one thing we need from this grand experiment is data, hard data on what we can move forward with in terms of a new normal, a better normal. And so just to plug something that Dr. Klutz was saying at the very end of his remarks, what is an effort that we are embarking on in terms of FDA asking for very specific data sets regarding remote assessments in clinical trials, and really hoping to learn from what has gone on since the start of the pandemic and moving forward. And on that, at the beginning of the pandemic, in March or so of last year, the FDA issued a rapid guidance on basically how to safely conduct decentralized or hybrid approach trials, so to keep patients safe. And just a little bit of background on that, the FDA for a very long time had already been thinking about decentralization of trials. There was already an internal working group, but as government bureaucracies go, it was taking a while to kind of trickle through and really reach agreement on some of many of the key aspects and details. Much of that information at the time of the pandemic was just rapidly put out without any time for public comment, just because of the really the severity of the pandemic and the urgent need to keep patients safe. Now there's an effort to revisit that same guidance that maybe it is the next step forward, right? How do we decentralize trials moving forward? And one of the key issues we've had feedback on is this notion of the 1572 form, who is an investigator? And that's something I hope we can get into in the panel, because going back to the agility issue, it's feedback that we've received that does seem to cause confusion, concern, and perhaps limit the flexibility of a decentralized approach.
Well, I think as we think about workforce, let's definitely come back to that on this topic of the 1572, because to me, it's there's a question in there about our expanded and augmented workforce that supports the clinical trial space, and how do we ensure that we're being inclusive, especially as we try to reach into communities, but not necessarily prescriptive that everybody needs to be an investigator or sub-investigator on a 1572. Great topic. And Andy, I see that we have you here. Welcome. Andy, do you have maybe 2 or 3 minutes of opening perspective on this topic around our workforce and readiness for this future that we've been talking about this morning?
Yeah, sure, Craig. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. My responsibility at Merck is to run all of the inpatient clinical trials. It's about 300 Merck-sponsored clinical trials and about 200 collaborative trials, largely in oncology with combination therapies with multiple different sponsors. So about 500 clinical trials in the sort of perimeter of what we're doing. We operate in approximately 60 countries, footprint in about 47. Our workforce is about 8,500 people. 45% of those are Merck badges. The others work in a in-sourced functional service provider model. Everything's run in our tool systems, process, operating procedures. We work with about 15 to 20,000 different clinics and sites around the globe and have about 60,000 active patients. So it's a big machine and it's a lot of work. Many of those trials were started 3, 4, 5 years ago in a different era, different world, different model. We have maintained the philosophy during COVID that we are open for business. We have not closed any study, adapted any protocol, or made significant changes, and we have focused on no patient left behind and no colleague left behind. These are 2 mantras that we talk about every single day. In 2020, we locked approximately 300 databases. We did not miss a single database lock. They were delivered on time schedule, and we delivered 97% of our corporate milestones in spite of the pandemic. There were obviously some studies that were impacted adversely, particularly those around elective surgeries. And there were many that actually surprisingly accelerated. We had HIV studies that recruited quicker than expected. Our themes have focused to be a little bit different. Of course, patient centricity is really important, and the decentralized concept has come up as we've seen all the guidances around the world change, and we've adopted those in different shapes and forms. But because we adopt them doesn't mean hospitals, countries, and sites adopt them necessarily. So the years of standardization have actually come to a head, and it's now the time of flexibility, and we have to see the episodic flow of the pandemic around the world, and we have to see that different agencies allow different flexibilities. So our monitors, for example, is theme number one, is monitors cannot monitor like they used to. They have to do remote monitoring and have access to electronic health records. So there's a massive evolution that's different in US, where we see greater access, compared to Asia and Europe, where there's limited access. Our data curation, as we look at sources of data through digitization, telehealth, through home nursing, we have to think about curation of data and what does that mean for our data, which is our currency. That's how we lock databases. We make sure the data is credible. It's changed our thinking of the workforce around data curation and securing the fidelity of that data. And then I think we need to look at the unit of work that prosecutes a trial in the clinical site. We don't do any clinical trial work in the headquarters of Merck or anything like that. It's all done in regions, countries, and hospitals. Much of our work is specialty care, which requires very complex infusions, complex procedures, but not all trials are like that. And where we have those complex procedures, those are best done in the hands of sites. But where we can do remote work and do imaging, collection of data, we do that. And it has added a complexity to how you resource at the site. How does the study coordinator coordinate that work to ensure that we're not missing data and it's collected at the right time in the right manner? And so we now have had to duplicate work, and we have to get source of data from a distal source into a source at the hospital, which is inspected. And we undergo approximately 100 regulatory inspections a year around the globe. And it's one thing coming with the theory, the practice of defending inspections and the credibility of data is really important. So those are the themes I've had about monitoring, data curation, and the trial unit that actually gets the units of work done. All
Thanks,
changing.
Andy. Well, let's stay with you for a moment, Andy. Let's talk a bit then specific to the workforce. What types of technical needs or gaps are you seeing in the workforce? As you talked about, there's different types of data needs with the diversity of data you're trying to manage and curate. There's different types of monitoring approaches you're embedding. Are you finding the workforce available that you need? Are there gaps in skills that are out there today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the challenges we've seen in the ecosystem at large for all of sponsors is that they're struggling with study startup is taking longer, as many hospitals are impacted through the pandemic. And so they are focusing their attention on saving lives of people who are COVID impacted. And so the resources available to research are less available now. They're limited. And similarly, what's happened is sponsors then do the usual thing and say, I'm going to add in 20% more sites to hedge my bet. So you need more sites, you need more monitors. So we've actually created a demand for research capability in countries and in sponsors. And so that's not a good thing. And so we've also then seen that there's a different approach to what's going on. Is in China, we're back to working the way we did pre-pandemic, okay? In the US, it's very, very different in our workforce. We've maintained this concept of no colleague left behind. So we've looked at ways we support people to work from home, new technologies, they've all got upgrades in technology. But we've worked collaboratively with sites to, for example, access electronic health records. And this allows remote monitoring. And we're looking at newer technologies, is how can we share documents that are privacy protected, that actually are robust enough that we can use electronic digitization. So that requires training of our staff, and it requires new ways of working to introduce a telehealth medicine. How do you monitor a telehealth visit? Perhaps you don't. And so you need to look at source and how that gets into the source. And how do you monitor the visits of a home nurse and get that privacy done? So we're introducing new skill sets for our monitors in the field. And then similarly for our data managers, we're requiring them to do a lot more work up front on data integrity of the collection devices. And we do that and UAT test that stuff long before we implement in a trial. And our challenge is it's not scalable across an enterprise of 500 clinical trials. We have to look at new study starts and pick out the studies that really need the technology. We cannot industrialize it at this point just because we cannot scale that, nor can the suppliers scale that. So the workforce is changing very quickly to a more digitized way of working and ways to integrate data from distal sources into central sources.
Preet, your organization must be seeing some of these changes as well. As Andy was mentioning, the diversity of data types that people are rapidly embracing, the shifting location of where different types of procedures may be happening must impact everybody from reviewers to inspectors to everybody handling data in between. How do you see regulatory authorities needing to evolve their workforce?
Well, I think that's a multi-layered question. So first of all, let me just start by saying, you know, I represent the US FDA. And this all, you know, as we've heard earlier today, all clinical trials, particularly in oncology, really are global endeavors. And I can honestly say that there are distinct differences, and there were, that we observed during the pandemic that companies told us about, in which they were trying to implement some of the elements of the COVID guidance in decentralizing trials that they weren't able to do in other parts of the world based on those regulatory authorities. So in terms of, you know, how I see this impacting the FDA workforce and our regulatory work, which I think may be part of the question, for the most part, from the clinical perspective, we're able to do much of our work remotely. But one of the key issues that's come up is inspections of facilities. People think that a drug approval, I think, is just the clinical data, here's the trial, now approve the drug. It's really not that simple. We have to make sure, particularly for new drugs, that they're safe and that they're being manufactured appropriately. And that requires a lot of international travel. And that has been a challenge in the setting of the pandemic. And in oncology and throughout the FDA, there have been delays of approvals as a result of this. I think that we are kind of moving to some virtual inspections, but some things just are really challenging to do virtually, and they will require some in-person inspections or visits. So that's something that we're working towards. Now, I think another part of your question, if I understood it, was just also how we're interpreting all the data that's coming into us from clinical trials.
And if you have the right people for these, I mean, I think every organization is having to rethink the types of people they have in their organizations, given the diversity of data that we're all starting to realize in these studies.
So in terms of the types of people that we have to assess the data that's coming in, the oncology group is pretty progressive in terms of who we hire. So for example, we have someone dedicated to looking at external data, like real world data, external controls, that type of thing. But in terms of remote assessments and whether or not, you know, those basically impact the bottom line, which is the primary efficacy endpoint, that's something that, with the help of our biostatistical colleagues, which are very robust at the FDA as a group, we are, as I mentioned at the top of the panel, we are basically seeking participation, active participation from industry to put that in a, basically like a tabular format, so we can aggregate the data to assess what impact remote labs, remote imaging, et cetera, remote clinical assessments have had on clinical trial integrity. That may require some outsourcing for staff, or perhaps some consulting. I don't think we're there yet. But right now, I think we do have the infrastructure to help assess some of that data coming in.
I think that was clearly a very progressive view of the Oncology Center. It's going to be interesting to see if other divisions in FDA make similar asks and if other regulatory authorities around the world do, because we, as was mentioned in the first panel, this is an area where we all need to keep learning and sharing. I'd love to turn to Andrea. I'm thinking, Andrea, about observation that Valen shared in the first panel about the importance of experience. And I'm curious, as you see these different commitments that research sponsors have been making related to improving the experience of participants in research, are there new types of roles, new types of workforce capabilities that are needed to fill the gaps in order for us to better meet patients where they are, better address literacy for patients where they are?
I don't know if there's new or we just need more. And so I think that there's definitely an increased need for certain disciplines. For example, particularly as trials move more into the community, or also as we are trying to engage underrepresented populations in trials, the role of navigators and patient navigators and nurse navigators, clinical trial navigators, I think has been well documented, but there are not very many of them. And also currently they're not reimbursed generally also. So I think there's a policy element that impacts the workforce as well with respect to that. But I do think that the role of navigation will continue to increase as we engage more broadly as well as more diversely in clinical research. And then absolutely as well with respect to health literate materials, I do think that there is an increased need and probably not enough practitioners who are really well versed at creating health literate, culturally sensitive, and linguistically appropriate materials to communicate about what a clinical trial is and how to engage with that. I think that there are also other levels of complexity with that. For example, creating simplified informed consent forms. So that requires a technical expertise in addition to the health literacy piece, in addition to people who are used to engaging with the patient communities to bring their voice to bear on things of that nature. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of areas where we need more highly qualified practitioners in these fields that engage with patients differently.
Andrew, there's a great connection there that you're making that I just want to make sure I'm calling out, because I think it's eye-opening for me. You're calling out the importance, for example, of nurse navigators, but making sure that those roles are being reimbursed and supported. And so very often, research sponsors and CROs involved in site-level budgets for multi-center trials have a lot of templates and a lot of legacy budget models that we rely on. We have all sorts of metrics for what a study should cost and what each task should look like. But as you're noting here, there may be new tasks, there may be new roles that we have to make sure that we're supporting.
I think it's even beyond that, Craig. And, you know, I think that we actually have to get away from this whole rinse and repeat of trial protocols and blow up how we've done it in the past, because we're in a different era of science. Also, we know more. And when it's, you know, when it's oncogene driven science, when you have the ability to model things differently using AI or machine learning, when you have the ability to do, you know, incorporate real world data, I think that we just need to rethink the whole paradigm from a patient perspective and then back into what is, if you come at it from the patient journey and how they're going to participate, because really in many diseases, and I can, you know, Harpreet talked about the Oncology Center of Excellence, I can talk about the oncology patient community as well, less so than other diseases. But in many of the cancers now, clinical trials are part of clinical care. They're not sort of a research vehicle of last resort anymore. Many of them are first line, and many patients are on 4, 5, 6, 7 clinical trials, where all of the assessments that we used to do to gather as much scientific data as possible need to be rethought, because is that really good for the patient? And is that going to help them downstream? So I think we just need to approach it entirely differently. So if you come at it from the patient journey, then you work with the FDA or regulators to understand really what is necessary to demonstrate safety and efficacy and what is sort of nice to have. And then the probably the biggest hurdle, quite honestly, is dealing with your own legal and ethics and compliance internally at the institution level or at the sponsor level. But because they are probably the most inert group of people, just as to be stereotypical in a class of individuals, but that is probably going to be one of the biggest hurdles to get things to shift.
So if I break some of that down, Andrea, in terms of just workforce thinking, you have me thinking about, do I have the right people inside of my organization as a sponsor, CRO, or otherwise to actively engage with patients for insights and planning from my studies so that they aren't just cookie cutter, the right legal and compliance colleagues who are progressive in orientation and aligned to the strategy of the organization, that this is where we want to go, and we'll work with those colleagues in a way to find a way to say yes rather than the legacy mindset of protect the organization at all costs. Do we have the right statisticians and others in study design so that we can fully embrace platform trials and other models that we know can better integrate research and healthcare rather than treating studies as a one-by-one disruptive instance to how care is being delivered? Did I map some of your ideas to workforce correctly, or did I just butcher that?
No, I'm going to say yes, but I think that we also need to be realistic that we can't just go blow up everything. Look, if you could put Harpreet or Paul in any sponsor, then I think we'll be in really good shape. But I know that that's not realistic. So, I mean, yes, in an ideal world, Craig, I would say absolutely, yeah. But realistically, how do we take those baby steps towards that? You eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? So what are those little bites we can take to move towards the right direction?
So I think that sets up really nicely some of the perspective that Nicholas was sharing from the outset. How do we make sure that we are shifting to a workforce and embracing a workforce that's ready to be agile and ready to adapt to some of these changes? Because we can talk about things like decentralized, but decentralized was 2020. That was our response to the last pandemic. Who knows what the approach is that we're going to have to rapidly embrace and evolve for whatever else the world throws at our clinical trial enterprise. Nicholas, can you double down on this thinking? What type of perspective do we need as we're thinking about agility beyond just thinking about speed?
So I'd like to build on what Andrea said. So she was mentioning the need to shift to patient centricity, and I understand the analogy of the elephant, but I also believe it's not that difficult to have patient centricity. I think simply to have patients at the table and to have the right patient profile. And I think there is a science of patient engagement with sometimes the need for patient experience, sometimes the need for patient expertise with patients that have a very good understanding of health system or the life cycle of drug development, for example. And there is really a science of that. There are good practices, there are very good examples, and even during COVID, I heard many cases from CROs, for example, that could make a fast shift to remote trials because they were addressing potential issues with patients from the outset. And so yes, I think it's not only, I totally support the navigator's approach, but I also would like to see, and I think Andrea would support that too, patients at the table when we design the clinical trial, when we design the targeted product profile, when we try to understand unmet needs, when we design the data. So the patient experience data we design actually reflects patient experience, which is one of the key challenges still today. And so I think from my perspective, I can see many practices evolving in that direction. I can also see regulators, FDA, but all other regulators across the globe moving in that direction, raising the bar in terms of expectation, in terms of how and when patients are involved in the process. The same with payers and HTA. So I believe there is a way there, and I really believe that that was probably one of the missing key why we didn't address certain issue in the past. I think we will probably continue not to address these issues, even with new technologies and the digital potential, if we don't solve that specific aspect, because I can see ourselves juggling with many, many balls, but if we don't choose the right balls with the patient perspective in mind, actually we are just adding complexity, and the only thing we are doing is to go, I think, in the same wall, but maybe even faster because it's even such more complex. and with more burned out people in the process. So I think that's really, for me, the agility that I would like to explore is not the agility just to do more with less, but it's also to actually better choose priorities, better choose the outcomes we are targeting, because we work with the patient from the outset.
Nicholas, is some of that a workforce challenge or opportunity? Is some of that culture as compared to different types of skills or mindsets we should be hiring?
So in my experience with the organization I work with, whatever stakeholder group we talk about, it's more a question of culture change and legacy of the past in terms of process, tools, and practices. But I have seen very little people that are actually against the idea. And I've certainly not seen people that really tried it and were disappointed by it. Actually, it's patients were always able to bring value, very often not where it was expected in the end, but still a very, very valuable process. So I think in my mind, it's much more a question of organization culture shift than people mindset or willingness to do it or not.
Andy, Nicholas is, bringing up some interesting points around agility, and it reminds me of how so many of the topics that we're talking about in terms of change in the opening and in panel one, these aren't innovations. They've been available for us for a very long time. You and I, Andy, worked on the first fully remote trial 15 years ago now, I believe. So this is really a story of adoption, it seems, rather than innovation. How do you see embracing that type of agility in an organization like yours? It's big, it's complex, you've got colleagues all over the world. How do you see embracing some of the agility that Nicholas is describing?
Yeah, look, I think we start with an approach of what's the output objective. So if you say our objective is to do X, then we reverse engineer and what are the technologies and capabilities we need to achieve that. And clearly getting patient input and insight into how disease is managed, what is their preference, how they would prefer to go to site or not prefer to go to site is really important for us to build into our design. But ultimately what we have to focus is on, we have to not only collect the data, but we have to get the product approved. And so there's a step beyond just running a trial, and there's a step beyond just using cool and sexy technology. What you have to do is get it approved. And some of the things we've used technology get highly scrutinized, and rightly so. We want to make sure that when you've used a device to collect an endpoint, that how that data is curated, and that's why I mentioned the data curation, it's done correctly. We've had inspections on the algorithms used by the vendor on how they transform that electronic data into a meaningful clinical output. So it is very complex, and it's we heard earlier in the panel before us about using the cell phone. Everyone's got a smartphone, but if you've watched the news recently, you'll see the number of cyber attacks and the use of cryptocurrency to pay ransom. We have 5 million attacks on our data systems a week, at least 5 million. So the integrity of a cell phone used by a coordinator or a cell phone used by a visiting nurse is a potential for a privacy breach and a potential to get into your data systems. It could be an entry point. So I think we have to think holistically about this, is how do we look at this? Our biggest challenge is making sure there's security of our data, and that what you do that makes it easy for a patient, it can be transformed into the trial. And I think we've got this conflict of, as we heard from Andrea, is that many cancer patients, their clinical care is their cancer care and is their trial. But in other worlds, I've experienced through the last 18 months, I've had to have some physician visits, and some I've been quite happy. I could care less about my privacy on, getting hit in the eye by a twig while cycling. I don't mind about that. I just want it fixed. So I don't see that as a privacy issue. But if I had a gynecological cancer or I was being treated for HIV, I think I'd be very concerned about my privacy because the stigmatization associated with those things. So I think we have to avoid the generalization. And our approach is to say, what do we need for the output of that trial? And certain studies, we can actually adopt a very broad approach. If it's an adjuvant study for cancer where the cancer has been removed, people are supposedly disease-free, and we track them for 10 years. if you miss a scan and you can do that 3 months later, or you do one distally, if it's positive, you go in centrally, that's not going to affect the outcome of the trial. It actually enables the trial and enables retention in the study. But if you're doing a treatment where you're looking at progression-free survival and you're looking at a change from 6 months to 9 months, which is quite a big difference in certain cancers, it's really important that you get the precision of that measurement done with the precision of the machinery and done repeatedly, so you have the data. So what I'm saying here is that I think we have to look at each case individually, not have broad paintbrush strokes that say, suddenly decentralize everything. There are components in a trial that you can just shift out and say, that can be centralized. This has to be done in a certain way. And I think we've got to tease that out and look at, in certain trials, does it lean this way and not that way? And in others, does it lean the other way? We've been doing patient-reported outcomes remotely for a long, long time. We've been doing a lot of assessments remotely. We didn't have the smartphone in the old days. We had a regular phone, and we did telephone visits in cardiovascular outcome studies 20 plus years ago. We've been using a lot of this stuff. So I think let's take the patient needs, but then also look at the ecosystem needs of protecting the integrity of data, cybersecurity, privacy, and bring all those factors in. And we do that in the planning before we execute on a clinical trial. So it's complex, and it's not the same. It's not cookie cutter approach.
Well, I think, as we've been talking about the importance of starting by listening, it's always been my belief that burden is neither created or destroyed. It just gets shifted around. And so if we're aspiring to remove burden from one stakeholder, we have to be prepared to manage and absorb it somewhere else in the ecosystem. But rest assured, it was somebody's burden before it got shifted, and it was probably the patient and the sites up front. And that reminds me, Andrea, when Esther was speaking earlier, she shared some perspective on the importance of bringing trials into the community. And I'm curious, in your mind, Andrea, where should community-based organizations fit into this story as we're starting to think of almost the augmented and enhanced workforce that's supporting clinical research going forward?
Yeah, and I think to Andy's point, I think we do need to be careful of what kind of trials go where and whether it's truly decentralized or if it's just certain assessments are local versus centrally done as well, hub and spoke model. But with respect to that also, and bringing some or all of the trial into the communities, I think we need to start looking at community-based organizations, the community-based outreach of local cancer centers, as more of a partner in the clinical trial ecosystem than perhaps they had been looked to before, because oftentimes they are the trusted partner of the patient, and they are the area where people go to look for information or a community or resources to help them either navigate through or with the clinical trial, or to decide to participate in it or not. So I think that we need to just have a different view, perhaps, of community-based organizations and identify those that truly are interacting with the population that you're looking at for your clinical trial and are trusted partners and resources for those, and then engage with them fully to help them help the participants in the trial as well.
Andrea, can you give an example for folks of an engagement with a community-based organization done right? So something they can kind of point to.
Wow. I would have to go back. There's so many, it's it depends on the trial. And quite honestly, I have not yet seen a trial in a community setting to be able to relate it directly to that. That said, one of the things that we do at Longevity, we have clinical trial ambassador program where we actually match patients with another patient who has been on, somebody who's considering a clinical trial. We will match them with somebody who has been on a clinical trial so they can understand what to expect. We match their caregivers with caregivers as well. So it's not, while it's not local feet on the ground, it's virtual. It is one way to engage with community-based organizations for how they are engaging with the constituents that you're trying to reach. Also, health literate materials, providing that information. Harpreet, do you have an example?
No, I wanted to circle back to something Andy was saying, but when you're finished.
No, go for it.
But Craig, I feel like Andy invoked the FDA by talking about the ultimate goal of approval. And he's absolutely right. And there is a culture, pardon me, I hope it's okay to say this, Andy, within industry of de-risking, right? You want the drug to be approved. That's what's best for everyone, in particular our patients. And so when you talked, Craig, about adaptation or adoption rather than innovation, that is the exact sentiment, but we have to ask ourselves why. Why was this not adopted? Nobody ever said, the FDA never said, you can't do remote assessments, you can't invoke, the use of technology or remote monitoring in clinical trial, conduct. Industry and investigators, investigator-led trials said, we don't want to take that risk because our bottom line is the primary endpoint. And I think what we are going to see, which is inevitable in the next, maybe 6 months to a year, is all the data coming in from all the trials that we're able to continue safely in the wake of the pandemic, and to the FDA. And, we play well in the sandbox, and we'll share all of this information, how it did or did not impact the bottom line, which is approval and access to novel therapies for patients. And so the data can't look any worse moving forward than it's going to come into us in the next, as it's already coming in the next 6 months to a year. So I really think the adoption is going to be driven by information, which is going to be driven by the data that we receive, which again is what triggered this call for a more harmonized approach, so that we can look at this data in a more kind of aggregate way. So I completely agree with this kind of idea that we're not innovating here. We're asking people to adopt, and that is going to stem from data and subsequent approvals. And then on Andy's point about selecting the right trial or selecting the right elements of a trial that could be decentralized, I 1000% agree with his sentiments. But even something like a new drug versus a supplemental indication, right? So if we know already the safety profile of a therapy, it's much easier, I think, to kind of have patients being monitored remotely when you already kind of have a sense of what to look for, rather than like a first in human trial in which you actually don't know what the toxicities may look like, and they may need closer monitoring, and they may need to be monitored by somebody who really knows this drug very well, or at least knows what to expect. So I just wanted to, before we lost that, I wanted to kind of follow up. And sorry, Andrea, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to get Craig's attention. But,
well, Harpreet, let me go a level deeper on that one with you, which is I completely agree with you. I think the adoption this year was not done by an aspiration to innovate. It was all around risk mitigation. The environment changed, and so things that were always available suddenly became risk mitigation strategies rather than being viewed as risky in and of themselves. I would argue, though, that the review decisions that will be made over the next 12 to 24 months by regulatory authorities in all therapeutic areas are going to become the barometers of acceptability and risk, right? Because your teams are making decisions over the next year to 2 to 3 years based on the studies that we're running in the year 2020. And each approval or lack thereof is going to be based both on the drug and the methods that were followed around it. So should we all be watching with anxiety for each decision and to get a sentiment of the level of risk in continuing to embrace these approaches going forward?
That's a great question. You're really putting me on the spot here. I mean, I think it will be important to watch how we disseminate information about the data. We are actively working for every approval in my division and every application we have in-house. We do spend time looking at what was included regarding COVID modifications, how that impacted the bottom line. And I think you will see from us, at least the oncology group, disseminate that information. you know, you have to look at oncology in a different context, I think, because we're talking about, you know, life-threatening diseases, potentially life-saving, life-extending therapies. And so the flexibility that we may extend, you know, may be viewed differently across other therapeutic areas. But I do think you could safely watch our approvals in the next 12 to 18 months as somewhat of a barometer. I don't know. I mean, we haven't, I can tell you, we haven't encountered anything yet that has precluded an approval based on COVID, but we're still very early here. I did mention we've had delays due to COVID that are completely independent of clinical data and how it was acquired, but rather the inspection issue. So it's very multifaceted, but I mean, I'm not going to give you a hard yes or no on that because that's just not what regulators do. I'm going to hedge it.
I wouldn't expect otherwise. Otherwise, I'd be an investigational journalist.
Yeah,
but
at least
Andy,
you're consistent.
Andy, did I step on you?
We will share information for sure.
Andy, did you want to react to some of Harpreet's perspective there?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's be real. The submissions that have been made in the last 12 months, many of those studies started pre-COVID. So you know, the tail end of those trials, maybe the last 10% or 5% or whatever it is, was impacted by, you know, COVID, potentially impacted. And, you know, we asked three fundamental questions. Have we maintained, we did a survey of 10 countries variably impacted by COVID, including China and Italy and these countries that had the biggest impact at the beginning. And we surveyed the countries in our cancer studies, and we provided this to OCE as feedback. But we looked carefully at, did patients maintain their visit? Did they have their dosing schedule? And did they have the procedures maintained? And the dosing schedule was in the 95% maintained, and so was the procedure, and the visits was the same. For those who missed, we got them back on schedule very quickly, and so we looked at informed consent. We had lower withdrawal of informed consent in COVID than ever before. We had a 0.1% in our studies withdrew consent, and it's lower than before. So what happened is people who are sick in cancer studies really wanted to make sure they stayed in their cancer treatment and therapies. And it may not be the same for someone who's, you know, getting treated for something that's, you know, not as serious as cancer, where people die if they don't get treatment. So we haven't looked at the other studies. But what we did look at is all of the guidances around the globe, and we changed about a 10 of our guidance. I've just rounded that off. I can give you the exact number. And we looked in those 10 countries we surveyed who was willing to adopt the changes. And for some of them, none were willing to adopt. So doctors were not comfortable with shipping infused medicines that are, you know, under their control to someone's home. And that was fine. For a tablet, which is oral medication that's heat stable and all the rest of sort of things, there was willingness to ship from the site to the patient's home. But not all patients wanted it like that because of the privacy. Their address was then made available to the public. And depending on their disease, yes or no, they would or would not take that. So we've assumed that everyone wants the same. It's not true like that. So we looked at a lot of different things, and I'll just give one. The e-consent.
Andy, we're going to run out of time.
Oh, sorry.
In a minute.
Yeah.
So I want to bounce over just quickly over to Andrea. I think she had a perspective.
I had a question. Yeah, I just had a question for both Andy and Harpreet, and Nicholas, if feel free to jump in. You know, listening to you in terms of like all of the changes that are happening due to COVID and the adaptability of people. So to bring it back to the workforce and reimagining the workforce, from both within the FDA and within industry, do you think that going forward, the people who you will continue to hire and continue to excel are those that can adapt to the new situations? So FDA, you know, historically going back 20 years, they were not the most forward-thinking people generally. Harpreet, but that was not the reputation, I should say. It was very process-driven. But now, you know, OCE particularly, Rick's changed it, that you, Paul, others are willing to be more problem solvers than just process people. In industry, it sounds like, Andy, from what you're saying, people had to pivot and to figure out how to adapt such that you could maintain your trials and you could keep the enrollment. Is from a workforce perspective, is that how it's going to continue to develop within regulatory and within industry, do you think?
Absolutely. And firstly, I'd like to second what you said. Is the agency has been very progressive and collaborative and worked together with many sponsors. So that's a good news scenario. And we've always been adaptive to the challenges that we faced. When we've developed an Ebola vaccine, we can't do that in traditional ways. We have to be creative in how that gets done. And when we do different therapeutic areas, we have to think very creatively. What is the workforce we need to think differently and to conduct the trials in different environments, different manners and that? So I would say, yes, we have to keep adapting. And what we have to do is take the very experienced people we have and change their mindset and reskill them, and then hire in new skills. And some of the newer skills are more digitally enabled people. 15-year-old kids are far better at programming all the gadgets in our home than I am. I have to find the manual and that. It's not intuitive for me, but they can do it intuitively. They don't even know what manuals are. They know how to do all these. I don't know how they know, but they know. And for me, it's a manual world. So I have to read up how to change and program the TV and all that stuff. So we're getting new skills in.
Harpreet, do you have a perspective on Andrea's question?
Look, I think we are a progressive part of the FDA, and we have been probably Rick joined in 1999, so I'd say probably since then. I think we'll continue that. We're guided by patient centricity. We're government employees. Our duty is to the public health, and in this case, as oncologists, the health of patients with cancer in the United States. So that's what drives us. That's what motivates us. And I do think you're going to see a continued move towards a more progressive agenda, particularly on this topic.
Nicholas, any thoughts on Andrea's question?
No, I would just confirm maybe that for the last few years, I've seen quite a shift from the FDA in terms of engaging patients and designing guidances that are raising questions, but raising questions because we get to it, and actually questions are being addressed as we explore further. And the FDA movement has a rippling effect globally. There is some work with ICH to harmonize all of this right now, and so I think I just wanted to second that and to give it more of a global perspective as a rippling effect of this effort. So that's the only thing I can add to that.
Just for the record, it was the FDA stakeholders at Citi, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, that launched the Mobile Trials Initiative, including creating the DCT recommendations back in 2018. It wasn't industry dragging regulators forward there. It was kind of the other way around. And by the way, those are getting updated with Citi right now. One quick last question. I wanted to come back to you, Harpreet, because at the outset, you had set up about the 1572. And there's a great connection here to me around our thinking of workforce. We were talking earlier about getting things going in the community better, but we can't expect a future where every physician in the community needs to be listed on a 1572 for every study in order to ensure access and equity for all. So what are current thinking around 1572s?
I think there is flexibility here. Again, we've heard extensively that this is a point of confusion and maybe even contention. I think the take-home point is the general feeling right now within the agency is that the decision to include individuals as sub-investigators, thereby requiring 1572s, are those who are conducting trial-related activities that contribute directly and significantly to study data. There's a lot of gray area there, and I think that is the space for kind of individual questions about your protocol, about who would qualify directly to the agency. I think the rest, so kind of local healthcare providers that are conducting activities that fall within the scope of their medical practice, could be listed, for example, on a task log, as opposed to being on a 1572. But this is a very active issue of discussion, and we're open to feedback about this.
I think that is tremendous to hear, because as we think about access in the community and decentralized doesn't mean trials at home. It just means opening up more access points. And that can start to open doors for access in almost any doctor's office, with perhaps remote investigators being engaged using video to manage the protocol interactions, but providing an alternative to the home as a trusted location that may be more accessible and convenient for patients. And so I think whether we're thinking about imaging that's local, using local labs, perhaps with central review, or some of these other alternatives, it will be interesting to see more sponsors and CROs and investigators engaging with the FDA around the 1572 rather than making assumptions about what we can and can't do here.
I think that's the key, is that any questions even around what I just mentioned as kind of general lines of thought should be communicated directly with the agency and the division responsible for the study for really more direct guidance on that. Don't make assumptions.
Harpreet, Nicholas, Andrea, Andy, your fabulous voices on this topic and so many other topics. I'm very grateful to have had you here with us for this last hour. And we'll turn the baton back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Craig, Andy, Nicholas, Andrea, and Harpreet. That was really, really interesting to hear. I think at this time, we are going to shift to wrapping up today's sessions. And I'll ask Paul to come back on. Craig, I know is going to stay online and he's going to start moving, but we're going to be able to hear his voice, hopefully, still.
Still
is that
here,
right?
And for the record, my daughter got a ride home, so I'm not racing off in the car.
Oh, good. Okay, then we get both your voice and your face. Barbara has been on the call. There she is. She has been having significant internet connectivity, but she has been following the conversation without being able to be heard. So thanks, Barbara, for joining back on. So what we would like to do for the last 15 minutes is really just think, together about what we heard as we wrap up. And I would love for Paul, you've already kind of concisely brought your thoughts together, but maybe if you could just, come back to some of the most important points of the panel first, and then Craig, we'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. I really enjoyed that last panel. It's so fun to see Dr. Singh, answering some tough questions. I mean, Craig, how are we going to answer, what are our approval decisions going to be in the next 2 years? I think that was a good question. I think but I do want to respond to that. I think it's not so much about the decisions we make, because those are always going to be based on the science and on the evidence that we receive and the strength of that evidence, but it's the transparency and the description of how and why we made a decision that's going to be so critical, to your point, in the future, because we will receive data, as you rightly point out, or I think Andy pointed out, that will have been conducted for 50% of the time within COVID. Right now, we've been receiving data sets that were conducted, maybe a month or 2 or 3 into the pandemic, where the remote assessments were being conducted. So I thought that was a really interesting question, an important question.
It's a great point, Paul, because that transparency is going to be so informative to this community. This is how they're going to understand what's acceptable and where they need to go back and re-engineer and rethink their processes. And it's not that everything is yes and no and clearly acceptable and clearly not, but where do things have to be adjusted to make sure we're getting it right? And we're going to have that kind of feedback, I believe, hopefully on a global basis, which is such an important obstacle to address for so many operators.
Yeah. And there may be differences, as everyone has been saying, in the global regulatory decision-making, because they operate on very different, oftentimes, laws and even regulations. So to wrap up, I guess, my panel from what I heard, I would bin it in 4 different major themes. One was education, and I thought it was important. As patients are brought more into the conduct of clinical trials, I know that it was mentioned that the upfront education of the patient on how vital, let's say, their electronically captured PRO is, or their ability to be involved in the telemedicine aspects of follow-up will be really important. So I think informed consent and upfront training of patients about what to expect is going to be more important. And that's the same also for local healthcare providers if they're part of the DCP personnel. Number 2, on the collaboration, data sharing, and transparency, this is a little bit about what we were just talking about. All of us have a role at collaborating and being transparent about the findings that we had with respect to how remote assessments were conducted, best practices, how we can do it better moving forward. I mentioned, and Harpreet mentioned, that I think what we're going to see is the worst case scenario on data variability, because these were deployed in a rapid emergency situation. What can we learn? And then we can deploy them in ways to mitigate that variability up front if we deploy them in a more prospective manner. We touched on global regulatory collaboration, how important it's going to be for us to maintain contact with each other in the global regulatory environment, to see where there are opportunities to harmonize, to do so as we've done in the past. And I know Dr. Pazder has a very big interest in global regulatory collaboration through Project Orbis and some of the other projects that we're doing in OCE. And then lastly, and most excitingly to me, is as we move things out into the community, in the trial scenario, in DCT and hybrid DCT, naturally, standard healthcare providers are going to start to see the value and understand more about clinical trials. I think that's going to be so important to what's going to be needed for true learning healthcare systems. Can we get that infrastructure and that talent and that understanding of science out all across the US to where we can deploy prospective, randomized, pragmatic or practical trials to do things in a more efficient way? I think that's very exciting to me. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Paul. Barbara, did you want to add anything to Paul's comments? You're on mute.
Why don't we hear from Craig?
Sure. Yeah, go for it, Craig.
And then I can talk.
All right. Well, that was a fabulous panel for us to be able to draft off of and build upon, right? Because for us to talk about workforce changes, we have to understand what the changes are that we're adapting to evolve around. And it was fascinating to have this group come together and, to me, start to break out 3 different categories of workforce evolution. One seemed to center around the skills of our workforce when we're thinking about our statisticians and others who are involved in study design, to think expansively around master protocols and platform trials. Do we have the right people to be able to handle and manage and navigate with the diversity of data that we're looking to include? But even away from just the digital aspects of our workforce, making sure that we have the right people in place to actively listen, engage, and partner with patients and other critical voices to embed and make sure that we have the right people that can keep our walls porous and make sure we don't drift back into the ivory towers of the past. I think after skills, there seemed to be this interesting discussion about new stakeholders, new people in our workforce, whether we're thinking about care navigators and other resources in the community, straight through to the implications of rethinking our 1572. And what are the other stakeholders beyond the conventional boundaries of a 1572 that we can now start to engage and include in the community, local to the patient, trusted faces and voices, and almost augment the mindset that we've had of the past around who is in our workforce and who isn't. And then finally, after thinking about our skills and the perhaps additional people in our workforce, what's that new mindset? That mindset that supports the collaboration and transparency that the first panel really unpacked so well. But as Nicholas set us up with in the second panel, the mindset of agility. These technical areas that we're probing right now are all the downstream solutions from the COVID pandemic. I don't know what the next crisis is going to be, and I don't know what the solutions will be needed to address that crisis. But as Nicholas called out, we have to have a workforce that can adapt, that understands how to properly balance risk and how to be able to pick up and evolve with different solutions along the way. I think with these types of workforce shifts, we can have some greater confidence that we're not necessarily going back to just the ways of the past, but we can actually chart a path forward.
Really terrific. So Sarah, if I go in and out, please interrupt and take over. But I thought that this was a wonderful, wonderful 3 hours to spend. And a couple of salient points came out to me. One is that I think there is a difference between pre-approval new drugs and post-approval that we can introduce rather readily when we know a lot about that drug or product before. And I feel like, you know, as I was listening, I kept thinking about when are we deploying really new science, new safety questions, new efficacy questions versus something that we know a lot about and then can deploy for new indications, as we saw with the recovery trial for dexamethasone. Everybody knows about dexamethasone. And what was interesting is to think about how well they did that work embedded in the country, and then advance the questions about hydroxychloroquine that we stumbled upon and continued to trip over ourselves, which is another one that we could have done so much better. I thought it was interesting that the first 15 or 20 minutes of the workforce panel, as it were, really spent a lot of time talking about the data integrity and how the workforce has to follow from the data, and the need for upskilling, new voices, new mindsets, as Craig was saying, comes from making sure that in the end of the day, our research enterprise delivers reliable data to answer the questions that we need to address. It is certainly, as we think about the kinds of things that we need more time to analyze and where data will be so helpful, the next number of months, I think we need data about what worked and what didn't in the new models of trials that were undertaken, and that we shouldn't jump too quickly to seeing that solution as, you know, yes, because decentralized trials or hybrid trials are more patient-centric, that we need to abandon much of what we think in order to sort of effectuate those. We need to understand, as Andy was saying, when we can and when it's problematic. And I think collecting that data from the universe of experience that we have, both for FDA and other regulated trials, as well as other trials, will be very, very helpful to us. So I also want to end with this idea that, first of all, the degree of collaboration and cooperation over the last 16 months has been unique and something we cannot lose. And that in the end, you know, what Lindsay said about we can have speed and efficiency and safety, and that we should be striving for that and not satisfied with anything less, because for every individual patient, their disease is the most important disease to them. And, you know, we've made huge advances in our thinking, our flexibility, our agility, and our trust in one another and the ability to cooperate. We shouldn't lose that. And our next session is going to be about global cooperation, because I think we really need to figure out how to both leverage what we've learned over the last 18 months, but also support it. There is no funding for the kind of intellectual and regulatory collaboration in the way that we need to make sure that we embed as part of the infrastructure of how we do our work. So, I just thought it was an incredibly interesting, far-reaching discussion today, and I thank you.
Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Paul and Craig. And I think two of the thoughts that I was really left with at the end of the panels were in the first one, really seeing this as a great opportunity and not letting kind of what has happened, the accomplishments that have happened in the past go to waste. So really moving forward with that opportunity. And just the interesting comment about, which I think we all expected of FDA serving as a barometer over the next year or two, and seeing what the ripple effect will be. Hayat, if I could just ask you to pull up the slide deck, and we can just look at the agenda for next week. I just want to share this with attendees, just so you can see what these topics are that'll be discussed next Thursday, the 24th. So you can see here we have a number of speakers at the beginning at 10 o'clock. And then the first panel will look at enabling regulatory flexibilities in a global context. And the second panel will look at regulatory cooperation and communications and issues of governance in a global pandemic. So hope you can all attend for that. Just another very big thank you to Paul and Craig for really moderating and facilitating such great panels. And thank you to all the panelists. And again, another thank you to the planning committee. So thanks everyone for joining, and we will hopefully see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.